Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. Before we get to today's show, I wanted to make an announcement. We are coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the debut of And the Runner-Up Is, and I'm pleased to say that you can now show your support for this show by getting some brand new merch. Courtesy of T Public, you can now buy shirts, masks, mugs, stickers, pins, and much more. Just go to the link in the show notes for more information. Now, this week on the show, we are talking the 1966 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Elizabeth Taylor won for her performance in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. But why did she beat fellow nominees Anouk Aimée, Kamińska, Lynn Redgrave, and Vanessa Redgrave? We will explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I am your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 39th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1966. We'll be discussing why Elizabeth Taylor won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is a writer and critic for places like Pajiba, RogerEbert.com, IGN, Slash Film, Daily Beast, Vulture. She's all over the internet. Please welcome to the show, Kayleigh Donaldson.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I don't know if people know this, but even though this is your first time on this show, this is not our first time on a podcast talking about the Oscars. We were actually on Nathaniel Rogers' Supporting Actress SmackDown about 1965. So this is just 1 year later that we're talking about films from around the same time.
Yeah, it's just a relief to watch something without like 2 hours of blackface in it, to be honest, because we had to watch the Laurence Olivier fellow, and that was tough.
That was pretty rough. Not gonna lie. We don't have any instances of that, not that I can recall here, so thank God for that. But we do have a lot of wild stuff happening in some of these films, so we could say that. But before we talk 1966, let's talk about Best Actress as a category. So my first question for you, Kayleigh, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
I'm gonna go with, I feel like it's probably a pretty common answer. Mine's is Liza Minnelli for Cabaret. I genuinely think it's one of the best film performances of all time. It's even more spectacular when you realise how wildly different that character is in the film from the stage musical. She's supposed to be English. She's supposed to be a pretty mediocre performer. She's not supposed to be, sort of wide-eyed but stubborn, but Liza Minnelli of it all. And there is something about watching genuine, unfettered star power at its height that is really unbeatable. So
Mm.
that performance is as excellent as everyone says it is. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely holds up to the hype and is a very clear example of a great movie star performance that really only Liza could have delivered with her kind of unique energy. So I love that answer. Very excited to get to that. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, pretty soon, 1972. So, well, my other question for you, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
See, for me, I'm usually in that sort of weird position where my favorite performances never get nominated anyway. Like my all-time favorite film performance is Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive.
Oh my
Didn't get
God.
nominated. I live
Yes.
with that. I think in terms of recent ones where I'm still kind of like, I get why it didn't happen, but it sucks that it didn't happen, was Isabelle Huppert for Elle.
Mm.
Just the fact that it was her first nomination ever, the greatest actress of her generation, perhaps. I believe she's number 2 on the New York Times list of the greatest actors of the 21st century, with this really fascinating, tricky, dark, unsettling film. It's really Paul Verhoeven kind of having his trash bag cake and eating the prestige of it all too.
Mm.
I think she does that in a way that I can't think of another actress who would do what she would do. I really think that aside from maybe Judy Davis, she might be bravest actress of her generation.
Mm.
So for her to lose to Emma Stone, which I think is a fine performance in a fine film, it's sort of like I get why the Oscars did that, but man, that's I'm going to be thinking about that one for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lineup that we've talked about quite a few times when I've asked guests about their most heartbreaking loss. And often Isabelle Huppert is the one that is heartbreaking for people for a good reason. And it's really a lineup that is like every person in that lineup is doing something vastly different. So that is a real case of apples and oranges for me. That is like, I like Emma Stone, I like Natalie Portman and Jackie, I really like Ruth Negga in Loving. Meryl Streep and Florence Foster Jenkins I can definitely do without, but yeah, Isabelle Huppert is incredible, and I love that that's also a performance that it feels like is so much in her wheelhouse, and it's not like she's having to do some kind of boring biopic, to get the Oscars attention. So I love that
It's
nomination
a
as well.
very Isabelle Huppert film as well. Like we knew she was never going to get nominated for like The Piano Teacher or
Right.
for any of like the truly bananas French films that she's done. This is as demented as some of her heights.
Yeah,
But she makes like 4 or 5 films a year, so it may happen in the future
that's true.
in between all of her like red carpet appearances and all of that stuff. It may happen one day. I've not lost hope. At the very least, maybe come back to Law and Order SVU for a couple episodes.
This is true. Yes. And look, she was just in 2 films that were nominated for Oscars this very year, EO and Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. So the Academy voters are still watching her movies in some degree. Let's get to what we're here to talk about today, which is the 39th Academy Awards Best Actress. The nominees were Anouk Aimée in A Man and a Woman, Ida Kamińska in The Shop on Main Street, Lynn Redgrave in Georgy Girl, Vanessa Redgrave in Morgan, and Elizabeth Taylor in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, with the winner being Elizabeth Taylor. So, before we talk about these individually, Kayleigh, would love to know your thoughts just from watching all of these movies kind of all in a row.
This was a really interesting kind of experience because my only real not back history with this category was primarily was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. There was a period in my undergrad very obsessed with Edward Albee and did a class project on why you should rewrite Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with a gay male couple. I got like a high B on that. I'm very proud of that. But also my kind of fascination with Elizabeth Taylor, which I think if you're a film person who isn't. So going into that category and really seeing how genuinely bananas it is, how it's so unexpected from what you would think of as like the traditional best actress kind of category. There are 2 actresses here who are performing not in the English language, which feels like a miracle even now, let alone in the 1960s. You have a pair of sisters here who are kind of the representatives of a really specific period of time in both film and stardom, but also Britain, like the swinging London scene. I mean, these 2 actresses are like, alongside Julie Christie, kind of the big representatives of it. But then you have it, the winner is one of the great movie stars of all time, winning for a film that she kind of really deserved it for. I mean, even Elizabeth Taylor said that her first win for Butterfield 8 was basically a sympathy win because people thought she was going to die from pneumonia, and it's a really mean movie that she's very good in, but it's basically like, let's call Elizabeth Taylor a slut for 2 hours. This one is a much better display of her talent, and it does feel like a film on the precipice of the new age as well. You have very old school studio stars doing a film that probably couldn't have even been made a few years earlier. Like the amount of, so not even like really harsh swears, but like the profanity in this film that shocked so many people, like Hump the Hostess being a huge sticking point for the censor, is so entertaining now, but it must have felt like a real slap in the face at the time.
Yeah, definitely. This is I think it's a very unique lineup for a lot of reasons. As you said, having 2 non English language performances in this category for the first time is pretty special. I think it's showing how the Academy is continuing to broaden their minds about sort of what constitutes great acting as we're at this sort of fulcrum point between old Hollywood and new Hollywood. I think in some ways I might actually consider this, an end of an era for this show and for the Oscars, in the sense that even though a lot of these performances we're going to talk about are a pretty new school feeling, the next year, 1967, is when things really explode with New Hollywood really starting to take over in a major way. And, it all has to do with the collapsing of the production code at last. It's going to come to an official end in 1968, but this feels like we're here. We're finally at this point where performances and films are able to go deeper and more explicit and more realistic and gritty. And yeah, this is a year that feels like we're sort of teetering on the edge of that, which is exciting. We have a lot of really fun nominees here, and we have the sisters nominated with each other for the first time since Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine. Liz Taylor definitely going out with a bang here on her final nomination and final win. So yeah, a lot of interesting moving parts in this lineup. So
I think it's also just worth mentioning that you do definitely see the Academy struggling with old and new throughout the entire year. I mean, you look at stuff like Antonioni getting nominated for Best Director for Blow Up, which doesn't get a Best Picture nomination, but films like The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming too. You have these like little bursts of the dying era of the mega 60s epic, but then you have it paired up with something like the fact that they even nominate the Battle of Algiers for a foreign language film, which feels so like forward and exciting in a way that I never thought they would have even acknowledged at the time. But it really, I think, shows the change that was in the air. But it is this weird mixture. I think you see it a lot more with the following year, where it is famously The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde versus Dr. Dolittle, as Mark Harris wrote about in his book. But it is fascinating to see like the early footsteps forming of the acknowledgement that change has to happen, but we kind of don't want it to happen at the same time, which is how A Man for All Seasons becomes like the big winner of the night, because it's so very British, but it's proper.
Right.
It's not. Georgy Girl and Morgan are definitely not proper.
Right. Definitely not. Yeah, That Man for All Seasons feels like it's very much like in the middle circle of like the Venn diagram of all the competing interests, So yeah, we're really at an interesting point in Hollywood. So let's get things started here, talking about our first losing nominee here. It's Anouk Aimée in A Man and a Woman. So this is our first of two non-English language performances in this lineup, and this is her one and only nomination. But Anouk Aimée is a French actress, and she was seen in a lot of films that crossed over into some international success, like La Dolce Vita, 8½, Lola, all films that were really recognized on a worldwide level. But by all accounts, her most significant moment was this film, A Man and a Woman, which is another French film directed by Claude Lelouch, and it tells the story of a man and a woman. Imagine that. And the man is Jean-Louis, a race car driver and a widower with a son. And the woman is Anne, played by Anouk, who is a widow who has a daughter. And the two of them meet at this boarding school where their kids are attending, and they get to know each other, and it's all about them just connecting and trying to get over the trauma of losing their partners. So let's get into it. A Man and a Woman, certainly an acclaimed film. It wins Best Foreign Language Film as well. I'm curious your thoughts on the film and on Anouk Aimée, whether you had any thoughts on her as an actress overall and what you think of her performance here.
I think the best way to describe this film is lush. It's a really wonderfully done romance, and I think it's one of those things that American or English language cinema often struggles with. Like, there's nothing saccharine about this, and it really could have easily slid into that. I don't know if that's just the to be a bit cliche, the beautiful Frenchness of it all, but there's a wonderful maturity to this, and from Anouk Aimée, who I really kind of only knew because she's in 8½. But this was like one that I didn't expect to be as bold over as I was, even for it's a Jean-Louis Trintignant film, like one of the great kings of French cinema. At the very least, there's a marker of quality there. But I was really taken by a romance that takes itself seriously enough. I think that with a genre like this, that is as earnest as it demands to be, it's really easy to slide into cliche. It's really easy to slide into kind of like Christmas card poetry level. And I think Claude Lelouch was far too skilled to do that, and it's helped by the fact that you have these two very beautiful performances at the start of it. I know there are sequels to this that I'm really interested to check out. They're kind of like the Before series, where they follow these two as they get older, which I think, watching it's like, yeah, I want to know more about these two. I want to see what it's like for the next 5 or 6 decades of their life. So I totally get why the Academy would be bowled over by this, especially at a time when appreciation and understanding of acting has really reached a major fork in the road.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, this is a really fascinating one because First of all, I do really like Anouk Aimée. Like, I mentioned with those Fellini films, she's definitely a standout in 8.5. She's had this long, kind of thriving career, and she has a very compelling screen presence that very rarely feels like she's trying to impress the audience. And that's very much the case here. Honestly, of all the performances that we're going to talk about today, this is the one that I feel like I can't really predict exactly what we'll be talking about, in the sense that this is a performance that is so devoid of big moments. Like, it's so slice of life in its plotting. You can't really point to one scene or another and say, well, there's her Oscar clip. I don't think. Maybe you have one in mind.
Well, I agree. It reminded me a little bit of I've recently become very obsessed with Mia Hansen-Løve, and I fell totally in love
Mm,
with One Fine Morning, which is her most recent film. And just that wonderful slice of life quality that you talk about, where it is, here are two people who are just living day to day, and what that's like to have this intense emotional experience to go with it, which feels so natural. So I think if this was, if they had to have like clips beforehand, I wonder if that would have made it harder for her to get a nomination, because it is that thing of where's the yelling,
right. Where's the
one of the things
screaming
that's
and the
so
crying
wonderful
and
about
everything?
Liz
Yeah.
Taylor, yeah, 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 because Liz Taylor does enough screaming for all five of the women, which is all because I don't know if there's a lot of screaming across this category. Actually, I need
That's
to
true.
remember, but
Yeah.
which is another thing that makes it so fascinating. I mean, now we have these really codified understandings of what typically lands a woman an actress nomination, at least for Best Actress,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just really cool to see a category where there's really kind of none of that. I mean, you can maybe make the case for Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It's a very, you know, it's an adaptation of a play of a very celebrated writer.
Right.
That used to be catnip for them, not so much now.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, this still was, this was not a man for all seasons. And I think that's so fascinating about this whole category. And I think you see a lot of that with Anouk Aimée, who would not have been impossible for her to be nominated at all, because, Sophia Loren's already been nominated a couple of points in her career. They are nominating actresses for films that aren't in English.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm fascinated that they were so taken by something that is ultimately not aiming to be that loud.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's necessarily subdued. It's really aiming for a lot of lushness to it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's not a lot of the kind of big romances that the Academy has preferred before.
Right. Exactly.
They're not lying on the beach kissing. From Hero Eternity style.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the thing where, like, if you maybe look at an individual scene out of context and it's like posted on Twitter or something, you could look at it and be like, okay, she's really lovely and nice, but I don't know if it's anything special. But it's like, if you take it just like watching it from start to finish, there's probably millions of people that have gone through similar feelings that she's going through in this movie, of grief and connection and trying to raise a daughter while also trying to sort of pick up the pieces of your life. And I think it's because of the simplicity there that people really connected to it in 1966, and probably still can find connections today. So I really like her here, and I think she's very much in service of the film itself, which does have that lush kind of lyrical quality to it that is very subtle and naturalistic, and she's a big part of bringing that energy to it. And if I'm being honest, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but she is so subtle and lacking in those big moments that I'm genuinely surprised that she was nominated, let alone maybe had a chance of winning, because her winning other awards before the Oscars, she was definitely in the hunt for this. I feel like this is going to sound like a dig at the Academy, which is probably fair, but like, I do give them credit here because it's like not really the kind of thing they usually go for.
Yeah, I tend to give the Academy like as little credit as possible. They have yet to earn it in 95 years.
Right, that's fair.
Especially with stuff like this. I mean, they still have really no idea how to deal with subtlety. I mean, if you look at the winners and nominees of the past, I mean, I'll be generous, 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
they love their biopics, they love their prosthetics, they love their yelling, and they love that they can see the acting. They really want to know that you hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And acting is really difficult to quantify. I find as a critic, like one of the hardest things to do is explain to a kind of your average reader what it is that makes a performance good.
Right.
Because I've had this happen so many times when I'm reviewing a film by someone like Kristen Stewart, and I will
Mm-hmm.
immediately get a comment like, she's not doing anything. She's boring, she's bland, she's not acting.
Right.
It's like, no, she's actually doing tons. And it's like, but sometimes putting that into words can be really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine as an actor, you're very appreciative of that kind of acting, but you're also very, respectful of someone who does lose 50 pounds and spends a lot of time screaming and puts themselves through this kind of self-flagellation because it's tough to do. And, they all still really want to believe that what they do is like very important in a way
Capital I
that's like,
important.
braver
Yeah.
than the troops.
Yeah.
And like, I love film and I care about the Oscars more than I really should, but it is that thing of you can't see the forest for the trees almost. You really aren't
Hmm.
even appreciating the work. So much labor, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Definitely.
You did all of the homework and I can see your results, but I don't see a performance.
Yes.
Whereas this is just so lived in, you know.
Hmm.
And it did remind me very much of Les Seydoux in One Fine Morning. I
Hmm.
imagine that this film must be a huge benchmark for a lot of French filmmakers, including people like Mia Hansen-Løve.
Yeah.
That sense of, what is it like to actually just capture a life?
Hmm.
And it's not always yelling, and it's actually it's not always dramatic, the things you even say or do, which can be great fun to watch and great fun to celebrate that. But, you know, when they do kind of go outside of that incredibly limited, space that they have created for themselves, I'm so appreciative of it. So just having this lineup kind of made me even madder that we just don't do it more often now. Because,
Yeah.
like,
I know.
you're not sure of options. Even this year where it's like, oh, how do we fill out these categories? I can tell you 12 people now, like,
Hmm.
none of you are paying attention to.
Yeah.
One, Mia Hansen loves films. Go watch them. It's almost comforting that nothing changes, to be honest. It means I don't have to replace my hot takes very often as a writer.
That's fair. Yeah. And I feel like when people say such and such category, acting category is weak this year, or a film year is weak, then it's just like you're only really talking about the very limited view of what you think the Academy likes. Because in reality, there's a whole wealth of options out there.
Things like Anouk Aimée, I would say, Isabelle Huppert, Ruth Negga, and Loving, you mentioned earlier, like,
Hmm.
they are the exception rather than the. And it's so interesting in the category we're talking about where it feels like the rule rather than the exception. That
Exactly.
never happens.
It really doesn't. Yeah. What's interesting about the film and the performance is I don't really consider it to be an actor's showcase in the traditional sense. I think it's a credit, though, to her screen presence as a kind of wistful, sort of everyday person who also happens to have these very striking features. We should also mention that, like, she's incredible to just watch on screen. That just makes her very watchable, and it's able to allow her to shine through anyway, despite not having those traditional screaming, crying, speechifying moments. So I'm kind of two minds about this performance, where I really love that she gets this nomination for such an understated performance that feels so ahead of its time in terms of Academy standards anyway. And I think she's very good in the movie. But I will say that there's another part of me that wishes she just had a little bit more to do here. I think what she gets is really well calibrated. I'm just not sure if I'm fully blown away by what she's doing. If she had stronger material that really foregrounded her on the same level as her screen partner, Jean Louis, who gets these long sequences to himself that aren't really matched on her end, I would say, then I would be probably even more excited about this nomination. But it's just one of those things where sometimes a performance can only be as good as what they're given, and they can certainly bring that material to life if it feels underwritten or not of great quality or whatever. But I can't say that I'm like fully bowled over by what she's doing here, that I think it's like some all-timer necessarily, but it's sort of like if she was given a little bit more screen time and it felt super equal between the two of them, I think I would be even more excited about it than I am.
Yeah, I totally get. I think with this performance as well, because it really does feel like it's one of two hacks. You need Jean-Louis Trintignant. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but you need to have them together in that sense. And I think the Academy has always struggled with how to two-hand her.
Yeah.
I mean, they're much worse with ensembles, but it's not uncommon to see one half get nominated over the other. You see this with Amour. Jean-Louis
Yeah.
Trintignant does not get
The
nominated
exact same thing. Yeah.
when Emmanuel Riva does,
Hmm.
and I think that film does not work without him. So I think that's another. I totally get where you're coming from. I think for me, it's just such a relief to see something so that feels so organic. And I think a lot of this is just me projecting because we don't see this very much most years in
It's
any
true.
category, especially just how incredibly stifling I think the demands of what is considered worthy of women in film as well, at
Hmm.
least in terms of the confines of what the Academy expects. And by that, I mean like practically every awards body. I mean, my big complaint about the BAFTAs is that they have basically just become like the Smithers to the Mr. Burns of the Academy. They're so desperate to be like this precursor to the Oscars that they've abandoned their initial goals of caring about British cinema.
Hmm.
And you see that with them nominating somehow even more limited in their scope of performances
Yeah.
than the Oscars, which is saying something. And then there's the, I can't begin to get into the Golden Globes, not right now. Um, so anytime the system is bucked even a little bit, like the bar is so low, I can't help but be happy about it.
Yeah. I definitely feel you on that one. But it's still a really great performance, even if I feel like, again, the material isn't quite all there. I think the best parts of the performance are just in the silences and the just kind of expressions on her face as she's very gradually starting to fall in love with this man. And also just in her interactions with her daughter, which I think there's very little forced there about her interactions with him or with her daughter. It's just extremely naturalistic. Just like the way that her body language shifts, like that scene where they go out on the boat with their kids, and I don't really remember there being any dialogue. I just remember her just kind of like shifting, and sort of like you see how she's gradually starting to give herself over to this relationship, even though she is still having to process what she's been through in her past, which sort of comes up again in the climax of the film with her sort of not being able to go all the way with him, I suppose you could say. And she just becomes much colder. And that beautiful scene where, he just asks her why she stopped, and she just barely even is able to say, because of my husband. That's a really beautiful scene. And it's like she can't really answer him when he points out that her husband is dead, and it's like this thing she can't really verbalize. And I love that quality to her performance because it is really so the opposite of what we usually see rewarded in this category. Like we've been saying, it's just so everything is inside of her, and even in spite of that, you can still see a real person here. And it feels like almost documentary like to me watching this, even compared to, Ida Kamińska or Vanessa Redgrave and these other performances that we'll talk about that do have certain naturalistic qualities to them. Hers, I'm just like, this just feels like we're following a real person. And that is kind of like the sort of thing we should be valuing with awards for acting and such.
Maybe we'll get there one day. Maybe. Once again, I asked for so little.
Yeah. Were there any particular scenes that you wanted to point out that were especially standouts for you?
Let's see more than just like, I think a film like this is so dependent on chemistry and you really can't fake it.
Yeah.
And I think these two have it by the bucket full. And not just in the terms of like they clearly desire each other, but there is a comfort between, there's a familiarity that once they're allowed to break their walls down.
Hmm.
It's nice for her to be with him. And I think that that kind of mundane quality is overlooked in a lot of films like this, at least sort of like, you know, that are more interested in the romance rather than what it's like to try and develop a romance with someone, to try and find that relationship.
Hmm.
I think that plays into the wonderful naturalistic quality of so much of this. They feel like real people in the way that they meet, in the way that they talk, in the way that they have to navigate their respective parenthood with this new person in their life, and also the remnants of their past and everything else going on around them. There's a million things that get in the way of you trying to have a good old fashioned love story, and what is it like to deal with all of that. And I think that if you don't buy for a second that these two would be good together, I think that's another thing that makes it so kind of aching to watch, is these two, they make sense, they are a good couple.
Hmm.
And I think that that's you cannot fake that. And we've seen so many films try to fake it with people who have absolutely no spark with one another. So many British and American films that try that.
Yeah.
There's no chemistry. Where is the chemistry today, kids?
I know.
Uh, one of like the 1800 things I don't like about like most blockbuster films is just like, I get it, you're both hot, but there's nothing there.
That's
Whereas,
all you have in
both of these
common is you're
actors are
both hot.
very attractive. Yes. One of the things is both of these actors here, Anouk Aimée and Jean-Louis Trintignant, are both beautiful. She's stunning,
Yeah.
but there's a believability to that in a way. They don't seem untouchable in the way that a lot of like golden age Hollywood romances are built on, that beautiful idea of like we just want to watch pretty people be pretty together. And I get that. I'm not dismissing that.
Yeah.
But with a story like this, there's something so well calibrated about their chemistry that it seems like it could have been so easy for it to tip one way or the other.
Yes.
And I think Lelouch's did a very good job of steering this boat into port, so to speak.
Yeah. It's very confident, his vision, I think, and you see everything working in concert to execute that vision, and that includes her performance. One other thing I just wanted to point out is just I love just in them talking about their careers and their lives in this very mature way without having to go to anything, sort of contrived or silly, or it's just there's something very dignified about it. And I was really struck by it, like in the moments where he asks whether she ever wanted to be an actress, and she's kind of a little at a loss for words, but she is confident in what she does, which she's like a script supervisor, I believe, and he is confident in what he does, and you're just seeing these two having these very mature conversations that two adults would have. And I imagine that, like, as sort of condescending as it might sound, like, I think that would be very refreshing in 1966 after the studio system has really kind of churned out movie after movie that can get old and stale in terms of the dynamics between men and women and whatnot, and just kind of having these childish dynamics sometimes and sort of contrived dynamics. Whereas this just feels like, yeah, this is a conversation I've had with so-and-so person that I love in my life, and there's something very striking about that. So, and I think the two of them
they're
play off
adults,
each other. Yeah.
They're actual grown-ups having a very grown-up relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds really condescending the
Right.
way I say it, but as someone who's a great lover of romance fiction, I read a lot of romance novels. You go for the tropes, you go for happy ever after, you go for this kind of the comforting way that it will play out, and that's wonderful. That's why I read those books. That's why I'm so kind of addicted to them.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something to be said for like bringing realism crashing down to earth on a story like this. What happens when you are trying to do this properly? When you have so much more to navigate that isn't like a wacky circumstance or, a quip heavy child or things like that. This is, that real life is more mundane than that, but that doesn't mean that it's lacking in beauty. And I think that this is a film that does very well with that.
Yeah. And like I said, her performance is very much in keeping with that particular vision. So, yeah, it's a wonderful performance. Love that we're talking about such a unique performance here that is not one that I could really compare with many past performances I've talked about as I've been going in chronological order here. But yeah, just as you mentioned prior, she and Jean-Louis Trintignant did their own version of like the before trilogy, like you said, with these characters in 1986, which is a film called A Man and a Woman 20 Years Later, which I feel like they could have come up with a more creative title, but that it is what it is. It's right on the box, I guess. And then they reunited again in 2019, just a few years ago, with these same characters for The Best Years of a Life, which screened at the Cannes Film Festival. I didn't have time to watch either of those, but I would be curious to see how their dynamics shift over time.
Yeah, I'm eager to check those out. I mean, at the very least, I'm fascinated to dig into how influential this film has been, because it just feels like a blueprint to some filmmakers I really like. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to find out if my instincts are correct there.
Yes. And I will just say one other thing. Hopefully this gets some sort of like a home video release at some point again, because there's a DVD that came out in like the early 2000s, which is out of print, and that's about it. And it's not really streaming anywhere. So we were lucky in being able to actually view it, but it really needs to get some kind of proper release somehow, because I don't know what's going on with that. So anyway, let's move on to our next nominee, Ida Kamińska in The Shop on Main Street. So this is one of those super special cases that I really love, when the Academy is singling out an actress who was never, ever on the radar of Hollywood or the industry at all before this, but they pull off this sort of undeniable performance that makes people take notice. and then, they don't have the benefit of knowing what would come after, but then that actor just really would never be on their radar again after that, just because she did so few films. And that is very much the story of Ida Kamińska and the Academy and Hollywood at large. So Ida Kamińska was a Polish actress. She was also a director and a producer. She was very well known as a theater performer in her home country. It was basically in her blood. She first started acting on the stage when she was a little girl, and she was directing plays by the time she was 18. And she established her own theaters and companies. And then World War II happened, and they had to flee Poland. But when they came back, she wanted to reestablish this local Jewish theater scene, which she did. And she had made a very small number of films, but she decided to take on this pretty sizable role here in The Shop on Main Street, which is a film from Czechoslovakia, a film that actually won the previous year's Best Foreign Language Film Oscar, which came out in the US here in 1966. So, I mean, that's pretty rare to have two foreign language film winners competing for an acting prize in the same year. I love that. But the film takes place in 1942 in the first Slovak Republic during World War II. And it's about a carpenter named Tono who doesn't share the same fascist tendencies as his brother-in-law, who is a valued member of the Aryan nation, but he's instructed by his brother-in-law to serve as the Aryan controller of a button shop owned by an elderly Jewish woman named Rosalia, played by Ida Kamińska, who is almost deaf and has mostly been kept unaware of what's going on in the outside world, and the shop is barely operating as an official business. She just depends on the generosity of her community to keep her happy. And Tono is frustrated with her at first, but he starts to develop a connection with her over time, which then becomes complicated when the Nazis decide one day to round up all the Jews in town, and Tono has to decide what he wants to do and whether he wants to protect her. So, like I said, this is a pretty unique nomination and a pretty devastating film. What are your thoughts on this film and Ida Kamińska's performance?
This was another one I kind of had on my radar for a while. My knowledge of Czechoslovak is very much kind of begins and ends with early Milos Forman. Although I did watch Daisies for the first time because of the Sight and Sound list, so I
Oh.
ticked that off the bucket list.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little trepidatious heading into this. I read like a little bit of the plot on Wikipedia, and the description of Rosalia herself is, she's nearly deaf, she's oblivious to the outside world, and I thought this sounds like it's going to be very broad.
Right.
A lot of the greatest theater actors never entirely made what made them so special on stage translate to film. This is different. I think this ended up being really. I mean, you mentioned it being a tough film. It's an absolute emotional roller coaster.
Yeah.
This was also, I mean, shamefully a kind of period of history that I didn't know, like Aryanization of Slovakia, or Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, just the Nazis taking over towns, gutting them out, and then driving people to the camps. So to see this really kind of fascinating, not quite moral ambiguity to this character, with this someone who's kind of ambivalent to what's happening around him. It's like he essentially sort of like shakes his head a little bit at the Nazis, but he's not really fighting against them.
Right.
He still becomes a tool of
Mm-hmm.
fascism, because basically it's like, well, I could make some money or I could not. What am I going to do? And everyone's sort of like, well, I guess we'll accept you because you don't seem as militantly anti-Semitic as the other guys. It's this weird power play that goes on. And by the time you get to that final, I'd say 40 minutes, when you kind of realize where this is heading and what's going to happen to Rosalia and what's going to happen to all of the Jews in her community, and the way it unfolds with Tono, it's pretty devastating. I mean, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I think it has to be devastating. You're dealing with history here, but the stark realism of it all was really surprising, because there are moments earlier in the film where that tonally it makes some really interesting shifts
Mm-hmm.
in a way that almost feels like high theater. But yeah, I was really bowled over this, and by Ida Kamińska herself. I mean, because it feels like she's kind of an impossible role here. It would have been so easy for this to be. It would have been so easy to play that almost camp.
Mm-hmm.
The moment you hear a character is almost deaf, you can kind of see the cartoon playing in your head.
Yeah.
So this is another one, like a kind of like Anouk Aimée, where I'm like, I'm obsessed with the fact that she even got nominated. What was did this film just explode in popularity somehow? I mean, it won the Oscar the year before, but it's always a guarantee that it will kind of reach the audience and a year after in another category. It feels like a minor miracle, to be honest,
No, I
for the
agree.
film.
I agree.
I was really glad I had the chance to watch it.
Yeah, me too, honestly. This is a film I had never seen before. It's a film that I've sort of been avoiding because I've heard about how devastating it is, which, yeah, it is. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I don't think I was prepared for the way in which it was devastating. What I think is so smart about the film is just how it presents sort of a happier world for a little while, this kind of community that looks after each other even in these extreme circumstances. We also have a few dream sequences where, life just seems so much happier, and then the contrast of that compared to what's really going on, and we see the very sad reality that is made even more devastating when thinking about, of course, how realistic that part of it is. And it just creates this very emotional experience, and it feels like we're seeing the kindness of humanity with Rosalia and her generosity to Tono, and she takes care of him out of the kindness of her heart, and how the community sort of takes care of her, and how he is forming this unexpected sort of connection with her. But then the rug is just yanked out from under them and from the audience, really. And I think her performance really is highlighting that mix of emotions we feel because of how sort of cheerful and good spirited she is through so much of the film. And there is, kind of like you're saying, some aspect of the part of it being like, hey, is this just going to be like the cute older lady who can't really hear very well? Like, how charming she is, that sort of thing. But I don't think she plays her as like cutesy. I think you see through so many of those scenes, even the ones of her just like laying out a bed for him, or talking to him about the Sabbath. It's all layered with what she's been going through in the past. We hear her talking about losing her husband in the war and how her family is all scattered now, so she really only has herself and this community. And I don't know, there's just this really gentle quality and a warmth, when she sees in Tono an opportunity to make a connection with another person again, and it's just really, it's really lovely and natural and just kind of graceful, her performance. And I don't know if you've seen her like outside of the context of this film, but even just watching a clip from her at the Oscars and sort of all glammed up, it is actually kind of a transformational performance too.
Yeah, I had that thing watching the nominations. First of all the women look fabulous. Like
Right?
Vanessa Redgrave is wearing her like serious, hipster glasses, which are beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So and it's a really beautiful moment. It's just, I kind of agree because I think that with a film like this, I mean, actually, it's 20 years after the war has ended, which is shockingly soon.
Yeah.
And you look at how Hollywood was kind of beginning to deal with what actually happened in World War II in like to the mid to late 60s. You kind of see films like The Pawnbroker, Judgment at Nuremberg, this sort of realization that you can't be a gung ho war film
Right.
when you know, there's no way to make a joyful war film where the Americans sail into the day, go over the woods, and realize what is camps, you know. So you have like these weirder, quiet films trying to deal with what the aftermath of Nazism. What is it like to try and rebuild from that? And then you have something like The Producers, which is like, like screw
Yeah.
Hitler, he's silly. The Producers is great. I still love that. It's one of my favorite Oscar wins as well, actually.
Yes.
So the fact that this is 20 years after, and also in a country that was decimated by the Nazis. I mean, there's this, Kamińska talked about how when she came back to Poland after the war, after she'd been exiled to Ukraine, I believe, during the Second World War, and basically her entire community was gone. She wanted to rebuild the Jewish theatre scene, the Yiddish language theatre as well. There's a little bit of Yiddish in this film too, and she really had to do it with just her and a handful of other people. This is you really get a sense of what it's like to see your community picked off one by one here. I think that's one of the things that the film is very smart about. Is, you know,
Mm.
for someone like our, very conflicted, occasionally apathetic lead Tono, maybe you tell him 6, that's a number he maybe doesn't have an understanding of, but the one woman he knows, her friends who he knows by name, who he sees, who comfort him, who he befriends, who he wants to look out for, that's a way that it is easier for him to quantify loss and to have that stripped away from him as he watches. And those final scenes where he's desperately trying to make sure Rosalia doesn't get dragged away by the Nazis. He's basically almost yelling in her face, "I'll protect you. I'm going to look out for you." And she's not aware, but you do see a woman who, frankly, has been through a lot of this before. She is an elderly Jewish woman in Eastern Europe. She has seen some shit.
Yeah, exactly.
And he hasn't. He has been allowed to be cloistered away from it for a long time, like many people were, including those who were like, I didn't know what I was doing wrong. I was only obeying orders. That old joke.
Yeah.
This film is so kind of unflinching about that, and to have it happen so close after it actually happened, because I don't think Hollywood was really
no.
Not in this way, anyway.
Right. It's really remarkable, the tone of the film, I think, that is kept throughout. And also the tone of her performance also, where a lot of her scenes is just her kind of smiling and just kind of attending to Tono and to what needs to be done in the shop and just sort of taking care of things like busy work, that kind of thing. And on the surface, so much of it, you feel like just she is just kind of force of personality. You could see how she must have been such a wonderful kind of person to be around in her younger days when she had her family and whatnot. And you just see the liveliness there, especially when she tells certain stories. And it's just like, even when he's like explaining in the beginning, like that he now owns her shop, she kind of just laughs it off and says he has a great sense of humor, and she says her hearing is very bad. I will say in the beginning, this didn't really last, but I felt like, is it that she doesn't have bad hearing, or is it like some of that selective hearing,
Actually, there were parts of this of my actual grandmother who has a hearing aid and will just turn it off if my granddad's annoying her.
Exactly.
Yeah. Shout out to my grandmother. But because there's a scene where he goes and he's like, "You haven't opened the shop yet. It's 8 o'clock. We have to open that." And she is sort of mulling around in a way that's like, I think she knows what's happening.
Exactly.
She has that wonderful look on her face, that kind of enigmatic smile of, I could be taking the piss out of you and I could be serious, but aren't you sort of charmed by it anyway? It's to be charmed by her,
Yeah.
And to be protective of her, but not infantilize her. And I think that's another thing that's really hard to do with a performance like this and a character. So often, old equals child in a lot of films like this.
Mm-hmm.
Add to that having a disability, to add to that the trauma. It would be so easy, I think, to turn this into like a lesson to be learned, almost like a cautionary tale, or like someone to pat yourself on the back. And I don't think it does. I think a lot of that is because she herself understands the weight of what this woman has gone through and what she's still going through. It really has never ended. And there's a weariness to her, but also an eagerness to just still get on with things.
Right.
She's still going to open the shop. She's still going to have her friends. She's still going to sleep in the morning and have her breakfast late if she wants to, because hell, why not? And that kind of way into the sort of power play that she has with Tono at the beginning. He technically has a lot of power over her. He could do horrifying things to her if he wanted to.
Right.
And maybe it's just dumb luck for them that they have a guy who frankly seems utterly uninterested in climbing the ladder of fascism, unlike his brother-in-law, who really is, his nose is as brown as his shirt, that guy.
Yeah, he's drinking the Kool-Aid. Yeah, it's really remarkable, just the complexity that she's able to bring across, even in those seemingly lighter scenes of her just kind of tottering around. You still are feeling the weight of everything. And even it's like when she puts on her husband's favorite record and she sings along to it in this very charming way and is talking about how, he loved the noodles that she used to make. And it's just her face, just the openness, the warmth of her presence, I think is just very infectious. And seeing how it all just sort of allows her to live in that past and allows her to keep going and not just be sort of stuck in the miserableism of her circumstances and everything. It's just as much as like towards the end of the film it can feel much more plotty than what we talked about with A Man and a Woman, it still feels shockingly realistic, this kind of picture of an older woman who is just trying to live her life in horrible circumstances. And I love that it doesn't get stuck in her circumstances, if that makes sense. Like, she's still shining through despite what it is that she might not even be fully aware of exactly what's happening, but we as the audience do, you know? So it's really kind of a magic trick, I think, that she pulls with this performance.
And then when she really 100% realizes what's happening, when she realizes that a pogrom is
Pogrom.
happening, and
Yeah.
she knows what that means,
Yep.
and panic that takes over her, because it is like you watch and it's so easy to be taken in by her and kind of want to comfort her and to look after her, and to realize that she really doesn't have any options by the end of it, because frankly, who trusts Tono to look after? You wouldn't trust that man as far as you could throw him, even when he does start to become quite pitiable. I think there's empathy for him, but not necessarily sympathy. I think the film makes a really interesting line on that front.
Yeah.
Because really, it's not. I mean, it is his story, but in the sense that it's not. He's not the heart of it. I think the film is smart enough to know that it does. If you're going to go along for the ride with this guy for over 2 hours, you need to feel in that the human nature of that, and I think that's why you needed a Rosalia, and you needed that performance from Anouk Kamińska. That is so well calibrated.
Yeah.
And hammers home the very human cost of what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
It was your grandmothers, it was your grandkids, it was the guy who runs the shop, it was the man you say hello in the streets. I think, and again, making this so soon after the war had actually happened, and I think that people were still grappling with the scale of it, of the trauma of it, and everyone's sort of culpability, and whether they did or did not do enough to save millions of Jewish people. I know that's something that we still have the conversation about today, in terms of the Holocaust memorials and things. So I think that's what makes this film feel so interesting and feels so weirdly radical, I guess. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it's a wonderful instance of, you could not do this in America. You certainly could not have done this at the time.
Right.
But maybe you could have done it later, maybe by the 70s or something. I don't know. This feels like something that had to happen in the community where it happened in real life. It had to be a case where someone needs to tell their own story, because this could have been mishandled so easily. This could have been more saccharine. This could have downplayed the real ferocity of what was happening. This could have made it more binary in terms of, quote unquote good versus evil.
Right.
And it doesn't do any of that.
Yeah. I mean, like, a Hollywood production of this would be significantly worse. Let's be honest. So.
Well, I can hear the saccharine strings playing already in what the Hollywood version of this would be.
It would be kind of rough, I think. And especially by the ending, I am struggling to, I don't even want to think about that version of what this would be in Hollywood, but I think an interesting comparison that we could make there is just the kind of dream sequences that we get a few times, once towards the end and then one at the very end, where she's just like dressed to the nines, and she has this kind of speech where she says fear is the root of all evil, once we no longer fear each other, and then she trails off and says, do you hear the bells? I mean, a sequence like that I feel like could have been very silly and out of place, maybe, if the film didn't put in the work to make you feel the relief of that, I guess. And I thought that there was a very nice sort of haunting quality to that scene, especially the sort of openness of the streets and everything. It's just the two of them walking arm in arm, not worrying about what else is around them. So, I mean, I really appreciated those sequences. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that adds to the really fascinating tonal tightrope this film is watching.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been really easy to have that ending be very saccharine, but It's appropriately bittersweet, I think.
Yes.
And I'm struggling to think of someone that could have done this in an English language film. I think even today, and that's the great argument that people have been having since film was film, really, is, can you really truly make an anti-war film? Like, whether it is a war drama, whether it's about what's happening around it, can you do it without sentimentalizing it? Can you do it without over dramatizing or fetishizing it? And I think this is a really good example of, like, here's what it's like to just watch your community be picked apart piece by something that frankly could have been stopped,
Yeah,
or at least could have been delayed greatly if a bunch of people who were your neighbors, who were your friends, who were your teachers, didn't go along with it in the first place.
exactly. And seeing it being played,
Doesn't that feel horribly prescient and relevant all the damn time?
unfortunately, yes. And it's playing out here, I think, in a pretty realistic fashion. And that is what makes it so devastating, is how real it feels. Especially, again, at the end, and her realizing what's happening is just the confusion and the shock, and just very gradually realizing the gravity of the situation. It almost gave me chills just watching her experiencing this sort of smacking of reality for the first time in the film. It's really tough, and especially to see the ending itself, which I won't necessarily spoil here exactly how everything ends in that regard, but it's really, really brutal. I guess the only other thing I wanted to talk about, which is extremely trivial compared to the context of the film and what we've been talking about, but there is a discussion about her not necessarily being appropriately placed in terms of lead versus supporting. And I think compared to, like what you were saying earlier, I think she is so much the heart of this film, and it feels like so much of a two-hander in that regard, that I really cannot see her being placed in supporting. Personally speaking, I don't really care about screen time. I know she has quite a bit less than Tono, but I just feel like you can't have one without the other, and she's so integral to the plot of this film that I'm very happy that she was placed in lead and that the Academy recognized her.
I'm kind of like hypocritical when it comes to category fraud. Sometimes I'm very mad at it, and then there are times where I kind of don't care. Like, I think there is another nominee in this category where it would have made a little more sense, in my opinion, for her to be supporting than this one.
Yeah,
I think that she is the force of nature at the heart of this film, even if I think the ostensible lead is not her.
right.
So, and frankly, I don't know if she would have gotten in on supporting.
Yeah.
I would have to kind of dig into that a little more, but I'm not mad at it.
Yeah, me neither. I'm happy that she was, because I got to talk about it in this context on this show as well. So, yeah, Ida Kamińska, a really special nomination here. And again, I'm glad when the Academy just goes out of their way to nominate something they wouldn't normally nominate, and someone who was not a star before this or really after this in Hollywood very much, as opposed to, like, nominating the same person year after year. I appreciate when they nominate one-offs, even if they deserve other nominations. Let's move on to our next losing nominee. We've got Lynn Redgrave for Georgy Girl. So it's time to talk about the first of two Redgrave sisters, starting with the great Lynn Redgrave. This is the only time we will get to talk about her on the Best Actress series, but it was not her last time being nominated. She received a nomination in Best Supporting Actress over 30 years later for Gods and Monsters in 1998, which is a film I love, and it's a really good performance there. But here's some fun trivia that people may or may not know. She is also the only person to have been nominated for an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony, but not win any of them. Literally the only person who can say that they are like a gold star EGOT loser.
I think that just gives her even more credit with like the hardcore Oscar people. There's nothing that people in the like Oscar community will fight for more than the person who kept losing.
Exactly.
The person who was overlooked or snubbed. Just yell Judy Garland in A Star Is Born out to the crowd, and someone will yell back, "Grace Kelly stole it."
She was
uh,
robbed.
uh,
Yes.
yes. So I think that you do get that with that's a great good record to have, and also she's Lynn Redgrave. Like, who gets to be mad at Lynn Redgrave? So,
Exactly.
and I
Yeah.
do love God's Monsters as well. I'm so excited that the Renaissance has given people a chance to watch that film again.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, her career, I mean, she is far from a loser, I would say. She was part of the famous Redgrave family, so much like with Ida Kamińska, performing was really just in her blood, and she did some theater. Her first credited film was actually Tom Jones, the Best Picture winner of 1963. Not a bad start for your first film to be a Best Picture winner. And then she made Girl with Green Eyes and then Georgy Girl. So this was very early in her career, and it's also a major, major showcase for Lynn Redgrave. She plays an average young woman named Georgina, nicknamed Georgie, living in London. She's a bit overweight and insecure when it comes to relationships, but she also has this very optimistic spirit at the same time. She teaches dance to young children, and she's a great teacher. She has this arrangement with her parents, who are these live-in workers for the rich guy in town, Mr. Leamington, played by James Mason. And he allows her to operate her little dance studio out of his house. And he also happens to be taking a fancy to her, even though he's known her since she was a child. So that's interesting. And meanwhile, she lives with a very posh young woman, Meredith, played by Charlotte Rampling, making her film debut here, future Best Actress nominee that we'll be talking about in like 50 episodes. But they have a very strained relationship, partly to do with Georgie really liking Meredith's boyfriend, Joss, played by Alan Bates. So it's all about Georgie sort of trying to make her way through a complicated world. It's the swinging 60s. Let's talk about it. Would love to know your thoughts on Lynn Redgrave and her performance here.
This one was really interesting in terms of that swinging London scene, that it kind of feels like an interesting embodiment. When I was watching this one, what it kept reminding me of was Darling,
Yeah.
the Julie Christie film, which I believe came out the year before,
Yep,
and
which
she
we
won an
just
Oscar
talked
for
about.
that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I have a really interesting. I love Dark Bogard, so I will watch anything that he's in. And so much of the criticism around that film was like, oh, she's really likable, she's kind of deplorable, and a lot of this film feels like them trying to soften that in a way.
I can see that,
and not necessarily badly. Like,
yeah.
I think that Georgie herself, like, they kind of like, oh, she will learn how to think for herself and all, take responsibility, but she's still paired up with with Meredith, the Charlotte Rampling character, who is awful, who is
worst.
like really contemptible, but is made like fascinatingly so because it's Charlotte Rampling, and Charlotte Rampling is one of the most enigmatic stars of the past 60 years. She can do absolutely anything. So I think Lynn Redgrave has a really interesting kind of tightrope she has to walk. She has to be the star, but also she has to have this kind of familiarity. Every time they keep talking about her being dowdy or fat, I wanted to slap someone, I will say that. She's so not.
I know.
But and in the era of Twiggy, I totally get why that she would probably have concerns about that.
Yeah.
This one has a really weird tonal problem, like compared to what the Shop of Main Street, which I think has a really balletic approach to how it juggles these moments of comedy with pathos. There are moments here where it feels a little more jarring. Like the character that Alan Bates plays, who is the guy that Georgie is kind of in love with, but he's besotted with Meredith, who just treats him like crap because she's bored.
Yeah.
And that character, to me, he's being played by someone who's going for much bigger laughs, I think. And it's weird. But I think the ending of this is really fascinating, not to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but it does sort of feel like the more like stern older sister version of what Darling does, where you got to buck up, you got to take responsibility, and the swinging 60s are over for you. It's really interesting that these films that embody that era of sexual liberation and freedom and youth kind of come down really conservatively in so many ways. And this felt really fascinating to me in that one. I don't know if this is aged as well as Darling for me, as much as I like Lynn Redgrave and Elbow. If we're putting the sisters together here, which we have to, the category demands, but I prefer Vanessa's film and her performance.
Well, I really, really liked her performance here. This is another one I had not actually seen before, which is a shame because honestly, as soon as that opening scene played out with just that unbelievably catchy theme song, and it's just her.
See, that was my familiarity with the film more than anything else, was that song.
Right.
Because I know that song was a hit.
Yes, and it's just like her walking down the street, getting a hairdo, washing away that hairdo because she doesn't like it. I was like, I love her. I'm in. I'm buying into what this film is selling. I just want to follow this girl and just see what her story is. And I had a pretty good time watching it, honestly, even though it does definitely go to some uncomfortable places at times, which is how Georgie is treated by other characters, like you're saying. I just think there's something very winning and charming about what Lynn Redgrave brings to it that feels like it comes from a pretty honest place. It feels like the kind of film that comes out and yeah, I don't know how people felt about it in 1966, but I would imagine it would feel kind of refreshing comparing it to something like Darling, which I also do love. Very interesting film, but it's also, that film being about this sort of impossibly gorgeous model who's bored with her life, and maybe not everyone in the audience could relate to her struggles. And then you have Lynn Redgrave here, who doesn't look like a super skinny model, who has such a pleasant sort of air about her and still isn't afraid to be kind of weird and silly and show herself as a person who feels a little bit like an outcast, you know? And it's sort of like the same thing as Ida Kamińska, for as strange as it is to compare these two performances in these two very different films, where there is a version of this story where I feel like the character of Georgie is a little twee, I guess, and sort of insufferable and really overplaying the sort of, hey, I'm a quirky girl, I'm adorable and relatable, but I think there is an emotional honesty here that Lynn Redgrave does bring to it that I guess does feel like it comes from an authentic place to me. Like I fully believed her as this person.
Yeah, she is refreshingly unpretentious, and I think it is to contrast it with Julie Christie in Darling, who is supposed to be utterly untouchable.
Right.
And for this character who is, slightly messy haired and guileless but not dumb, she is very well educated. And she's very aware of how nasty a lot of the situations she's in are. Like when James Mason's character, like who has known her since she was a child, as you mentioned, basically hands her a legal contract and is like, "Will you be my mistress?"
Yep.
She is aware that she can't outright say no because this man like kind of says that she owes him, or at least her family owes him, and she doesn't want to marry him, or not even marry him. She doesn't want to be his mistress. She doesn't want to be his little plaything, but she has to sort of sidestep it in a way that she's in control of it, but it plays off the idea that people do think she's kind of a child. I think she's really smart on that front. Yeah. And then the kind of decision she ultimately has to make, which is a really cruel one when you think about it. I don't think you need to think about it that much. She really is left with very little choice in the matter by the time she gets to the end of it. And I think that's, I think it speaks to the strength of Lynn Redgrave in this more than the film itself. That I think she has a better grasp on that character than the rest of it. It would be so easy for that character to sort of float through the story like debris, and she doesn't. So she has that going for her. But actually, you mentioned about it, like if this film was kind of how it would have been seen at the time. I find this really fun quote. Apparently, the British censors thought that this was the most immoral script they'd ever read.
Oh boy.
Which is fascinating to me because, like, really? I mean, it does very candidly deal with abortion and premarital sex and infidelity, but it's like, again, I saw Darling the year before, and I've seen a lot of films from that era that would have, like, made your monocles fall off a little more harshly. What was it about? I don't know. Is it because it's designed to be so very approachable,
Maybe.
It is a film that was intended for the mainstream and made a lot of money. It was a big hit. And not just because of that song. Like, this was a film, for the masses at a time when the kitchen sink drama is kind of beginning to really gain a foothold with British film. Right. It's not all, and obviously there's still A Man for All Seasons, you're The Lion, Winters, you're Olivers and things, which all become huge hits in the years after this and are sort of what I think today are still kind of seen as the platonic of what America wants from a British film.
Yeah.
Add a couple of biopics in there and you're done. This would later become its own kind of cliche. It's not quite as frivolous as a lot of these stories can be, but I'm so fascinated by the idea that this was just absolutely hard and inexcusable. I wonder if it's because of the coldness with which Charlotte Rampling says to Alan Bates, I think the word she has destroyed 2 of your kids before. It's saying she's had an abortion twice.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes from the Charlotte Rampling character, honestly, would be my guess.
Yeah, I think there's still that sense of, like, depiction of bad person in film equals bad in real life still juggling with today. You have no idea how many comments I get like that on pieces I write about. It's like, please, please, like nuance. Let's try it.
Yes.
Just today. So I would love it if Charlotte Rampling had gotten nominated for this, but it took a really long time for them to acknowledge that she existed as an
Yeah,
actress.
it really, really did. But yes, depiction does not equal endorsement. Bold, bold,
Maybe get
underline.
that embroidered on a pillow or something.
Yes, truly. Now more than ever, we do need that message to be out there. But yeah, like just also the dynamic between her and Charlotte Rampling's character, now that we're talking about it, I think is really fascinating because they don't seem to have much regard for each other. And like, even when or what's her name, Meredith? Yeah, Meredith wants to go out and just do her own thing, even though her boyfriend is coming over. It's very evident that Georgie kind of just starts to have this nervous energy and her sort of bashful, kind of nervous laughing when he's around. And it's very clear that she's head over heels for this guy. I think that is another thing that is very well calibrated, where that could seem a little silly and childish, but she still makes it feel kind of relatable and down to earth, I would argue. Even when she's saying things like, "I feel like a brontosaurus" when she's around. I feel like you're hearing these things and seeing these things that feel like this is where an audience in 1966 would really identify with this character in a sort of proto Bridget Jones sort of way. I've definitely seen that comparison thrown around.
I definitely see it in the sense of like, I think every person, but I'll say specifically a lot of women know what it's like to keep being friends with someone who's just the worst.
Yeah.
And you finally kind of acknowledge one day, like, they shouldn't be friends with this person.
Right.
But kind of kicking them out of your life is easier said than done. I mean, she basically doesn't get to make that choice ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Meredith kind of fucks off on her own.
Right.
And she's, and it kind of takes that realization that she's so. I mean, it's so fascinating as well. Like, you see that scene of her in the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and she makes a point about like, "Oh, there's the baby you really wanted. I didn't want to do it. I hate that thing. I'm not even going to look at it. You can do whatever the hell you want with it." And everyone is sort of disgusted, as you would be. I think your instinctive reaction would be that. And she's played as so cold. Like, there's not a hint of regret over it. There's not a hint of like, maybe she has depression. Maybe she has had a traumatic birth or something like that. There's none of that. It is really played very much as she is the absolute worst. And Rampling is kind of happy to lean into the vampirish qualities of that. And it's so enthralling to watch. I think that's another thing, is we've all had that friend you don't want to be around, but there is something magnetic about that pull. I totally get wanting to hang out with Charlotte Rampling, even if she's just like evil,
Yeah.
I've seen Dune. I could deal with that.
Right? She's still got it.
No, she still got it. I mean, that's what's so exciting to watch her, but this being her like really first performance in film, is she always had it. There's something so enigmatic about her. There's something so I think cool is almost kind of a cliche, but she really just seems so utterly in control at every single moment, and she's never lost that.
Yeah.
You can watch what she does here, you can watch what she does in The Night Porter, and you can compare it to something like Vendetta or 45 Years,
yeah,
or Dune. To say again, like, it's that steeliness. It's very hard to replicate. I totally get why the French love her, as they should.
As they should. Yes, even in films that aren't as good, like, or characters that aren't like super as fascinating, like Red Sparrow even is another recent one. It's just she still maintains that. She kind of just like weaponizes that sense of control and knowing that she has control over people. So yeah, this is not a Charlotte Rampling podcast, but we will get to her way down the line.
If you ever do a Charlotte Rampling podcast, like, I will be there for like 4 or 5 films. I could talk about The Night Porter for like 8 hours.
Yes. But with Lynn Redgrave, I think I really just love seeing the scenes where she is having to navigate a very uncomfortable situation and just trying to figure out her way out of it. Like, especially in the scene where James Mason character is handing her that legal contract to be his mistress and sort of like still having to accept payment from him. Just that complicated mix of emotion is really, really striking for me. And that is a scene that takes place, I believe, after the scene where he is, she goes to the party and just like dresses up and sings that song in front of everyone. And it's just like no cautiousness at all, no shame, just like fully committed to the bodiness of that performance. I found to be very delightful and just fun to watch, just her command the screen. And then to have it right after that have a much more withdrawn kind of scene as she tries to find her way out of this situation, and just like the look of horror when she realizes what he's saying, I think is really well played.
Yeah, I totally get why this film feels like a very much like, I get why this film is really big at this moment in time.
Yeah.
Good use of your James Mason.
Yeah.
Like the coldness he has. Like this is a guy who really has either no understanding of basic romantic emotions or no time for them.
Mm-hmm.
He's very businesslike to the point where his like idea for seducing Georgie isn't seduction. It's here's a formal contract. He's very like there's a straightforwardness to him that he's not playing as creepy, but but he understands how kind of unsettling that power play actually is.
Yeah.
Like there's a point where he says that like he says he's 47, right?
I'm 49.
Or he's 49 actually, yeah. But like but he could be younger. It's like, no, you couldn't. Like, no. I think you're in your late 50s when you're doing this role. You're very clearly like so much older than her, and you enjoy that. You do enjoy the kind of like because he does say that, like he thinks Georgie owes him, and her family owes him, and she has to make a very clinical decision about that eventually. That's her kind of like putting away childish things moment.
Yeah.
And it's dark. I found it very dark anyway.
Yeah. And by the way, him doing this like shortly after doing Lolita.
Oh, yes.
It's yeah, good for you, James Mason, for really pushing the limits there in terms of
it's just nice to remember what he actually sounds like after having to listen to years of just James Mason impressions.
This is true. Yes,
like, oh yeah, you're actually like relatively normal sounding.
I really just like all of those scenes where she is having to figure out how to approach certain situations, because she is kind of like halfway between child and adult in a sense. And like even when the Alan Bates character is sort of toying with her almost, and she enjoys the attention that he's giving to her, but also feels like she's slightly resenting how much he toys with her emotions. And it's like that feeling of being played around, almost like played with, I think is very palpable, and I think very relatable as well. This is another relatable aspect to this character of her like wanting, like she always wanted to be with this guy Joss, but he was always with Meredith, and now she has his attention, but also she's starting to slowly realize that like he's not so great. And just her trying to manage her way through it, I think, is the nuance of that. I think she really understands just how to express and not go too far with it and not go too two-dimensional with it. You're seeing that mix of emotion as she's trying to process, like, I'm in this situation now. I've never really had a boyfriend, but also this guy is turning out to be kind of a jerk. Maybe he always was a jerk. What do I do?
I think that's another thing about her that is deeply relatable, is like realizing your best friend sucks, but realizing like the man of your dreams is just the worst.
Yeah.
Oh, honey, like I totally get why this to a lot of people feels like a proto Bridget Jones. Is that thing of that, like, what is it like to have the sort of the quote unquote best years of your life be just dominated by like everything coming crashing down to earth, and realizing actually adulthood sucks. The eternal truth of coming of age dramas everywhere, It sucks to have to deal with adult bullshit.
Exactly. And then towards the conclusion, we get this big argument between the three of them that then leads to her and Joss kissing rather impulsively, after which point she immediately runs away. Some kind of fun physical comedy there, but then I feel like it sort of turns into that thing where it's like a guy harassing a woman until she relents, which I feel like has been so commonplace with films, like comedies, especially around the time, like through the 80s and 90s. Feels like that was a big time for that, where it's just like, here's this impossible man child, and this is just like a story about him wearing her down until she sort of relents, you know? So that part of it I
I
did.
did appreciate that that wasn't played as like the ultimate romance because, like you said, there's so many stories where that has been like
Yeah.
almost a default mode of a lot of romantic comedies. Like, there's the schlubby guy and the woman who's totally out of his league, and he's basically going to publicly blackmail her until she gives in.
Right.
And in this version, you know, here's what it's actually like to have to deal with a man child. Here's what it's like to actually deal with a guy who has the attention span of your average beagle. Because like that's the thing that I think bonds him to Meredith so much is like, she gets bored with him really easily, and then he gets bored with Georgie really quickly. He has absolutely no interest in, that scene where she's trying to talk to, like, the social services has basically come down. She's like, oh yes, and he's got a wonderful job and he's so responsible and we're going to do things together properly, and then he just barges in the door, is like,
Yeah.
screw that.
Mm-hmm.
He has absolutely no consideration, and I do think that would work better with a darker, like, actor. I really do think that he does Alfie this year, and he feels very like
Right.
working class Alfie in places.
Yeah.
But I totally get why people would be like, if this film was like, if Tumblr was around in the 60s,
Oh God.
there would be so many Georgie fan arts. Like, people would. I mean, they think Peace is on to eternity, but I think there would be so much love for her.
Yeah, that's true.
There is something to be said about every era getting like the spunky average girl of their time, or woman, I should say.
Right. There would probably be a lot of discourse about this film and her and all this stuff, and really just overanalyzed to death, I would imagine. But yeah, the one other part of it I wanted to talk about is just her decision, which, who's to say if it's really a decision or something that's hoisted upon her, is just her having to raise this baby that Meredith has given birth to and since abandoned completely, and just like raise it on her own with Joss. But then he just kind of gets tired of it pretty quickly. The sort of natural progression of that and her becoming sort of disillusioned with him to the fullest extent there, I think, is really well done. And she shows sort of how she's so used to being mistreated, and every effort she makes to do the responsible thing is just like met with mockery or anger, and you see her frustration in that without her having to overplay it. My question for you is if you feel like this ending is earned and it makes sense that she would be in this situation of, I'm kind of stuck with this baby, I want to raise this baby, and so I'm going to have to do what is best for this baby and decide to marry James Mason.
I mean, I mentioned I think the ending is really bleak, which I think
Yeah.
it is a point of, she's made a choice, but it's also a choice that is, one of maybe like, what are her options? It's either that, gives up maybe social services, and then continues fending off James Mason until she figures out what she actually really wants to do, or what that she is able to do.
Right.
I know that this must have just been because the baby was tired today, but that baby is wailing and screaming when they drive off.
I know.
And it kind of feels like that poor baby was really missing their mum that day. And I think it ends up like weirdly working for that moment, because it is like, well, this is what we have, and she's going to have to make the most of it. But it's also really clear that her focus is on that baby and not James Mason.
Right. Right.
Maybe she made this. She's had an impossible choice, but she's ultimately, I think, made it for a good reason, for a very kind-hearted reason.
Yeah.
Which is something that most of the people around her would never do or never seem able to do.
Exactly.
So it does feel like a weirdly conservative ending in that sense. Like,
yeah.
I think that's what's really interesting about a lot of these films. Like, even Darling,
mm-hmm.
like, you couldn't have her be a true anti-hero in Darling. She still has to kind of be quote-unquote punished at the end, although Julie Christie makes that character feel so human in a way you can't help but empathize with her. I think that it's a little easier for Georgie because she is so relatable and so sympathetic, but she was never going to run off into the sunset and be like, fuck that kid.
I would like to see that alternate ending, though.
Skipping off into the sunset as that amazing song plays.
Yeah, right? I would like that, a reprise of Georgy
The
Girl.
song is great. If you haven't heard the song is a
It's
blast.
an incredible song, and I've had it stuck in my head this entire week. Anyway, I really love Georgy Girl as a film, even though it does have flaws. I did just find it to be a fascinating sort of time capsule almost, much like Darling was, of a very specific place and time. So let's move on to our final losing nominee, Vanessa Redgrave in Morgan! Exclamation point. So the other Redgrave sister here, and one who had a much stronger track record with the Academy. We're going to be talking about Vanessa Redgrave quite a bit on this show, and this is where it all began. She would eventually win Best Supporting Actress for Julia in 1977, but she gets multiple lead nominations, including this one, Isadora, Mary Queen of Scots, and The Bostonians, and one more in Supporting Actors for Howard's End. But to get into her background, like her sister, very much grew up in an artist household. Her first film role was in Behind the Mask with her father, Michael Redgrave. But Morgan was her first semi-major moment in film that helped to raise her to prominence. So we are talking about another comedy here, much like Georgy Girl. Morgan is about a working class artist in London. Morgan, played by David Warner, whose wife, Leonie, is divorcing him. Leonie, played by Vanessa Redgrave. And Morgan is slightly lower class than Leonie, and he was raised as a communist, while Leonie has this upper class capitalist background. And Morgan is very eccentric, I would almost argue disturbed young man who decides to protest his wife's wanting of a divorce with a series of erratic behavior, including putting a skeleton in her bed, all the way escalating to the point of having a friend of his kidnap her in the hope of convincing her to be with him again. And it's mostly about his own struggles to really cope with the reality of this situation, and her just kind of having to react to all of the nonsense that he's putting forth. So what are your thoughts on Vanessa Redgrave as an actress, and what do you think of her here in Morgan?
First, I love her. She is one of my absolute favorite actresses. I love that she has remained fiercely left wing for decades,
She
even
has.
though it has caused her immense strife in her career. I love that she has sort of aged into that level of like kindly grandmother now, while everyone forgets that she's like a massive left winger. I
Yeah.
love it. My mum is a huge fan of Called Midwife, so she kind of listens to her lovely dulcet tones every week.
Oh.
This was a really interesting film because this was other than Virginia Woolf, this was the only one I'd actually seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Because a few months ago when James Caan died, my former film studies professor, who does film screenings for us, put on The Gambler, which is a Carol Rice film, and I'd never
Mm-hmm.
seen it before. Like, this is great. He says, well, David Warner's just died. Why don't we put on another Carol Rice film? And we ended up watching Morgan. And we were also taken by this film. We ended up having a mini Carol Rice marathon, which was really interesting. We ended up watching The French Lieutenant's Woman. We ended up
Yeah.
watching Night Must Fall, which is like this serial killer film with Albert Finney.
Mm-hmm.
And then we watched Who'll Stop the Rain, which is just one of our favorite films anyway. So this was a wonderful moment last year where we got introduced to this incredible filmmaker who's kind of been forgotten. I think he's still best known for his first film, which is Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which is one of the great kitchen sink dramas. But Morgan is fascinating. It is a
Yeah.
genuinely like really esoteric and radical comedy that takes wild plot swings and wild tonal shifts and has at the center of it, I think, this brilliant David Warner performance that I'm really sad didn't get more recognition. He is playing a genuinely like deeply mentally ill man
Mm-hmm.
who is a strange, varied mishmash of contradictions in terms of politics and ideas, who is occasionally kind of quote unquote quirky, but is often just dangerous. And the film is navigating what it's like to be stuck with this hurricane of a man. And in the case of Vanessa Redgrave, she's his like soon to be ex-wife who has basically kind of gotten sick of his bullshit and is going to marry a man who's actually of her social standing, but she's clearly still very fond of him and still very attracted to him, and plays all of these games with him. And it's so fascinating to watch Vanessa Redgrave as like the seductress, which I don't think is a role that she really got to play much in her career. She is this very, it's another kind of swinging London sort of trope, I think. This very glamorous, kind of bored rich girl who is playing with the commie, basically.
Right.
And the weird fantasy moments you get, it's not the stunts that this guy pulled up. There is a moment involving a gorilla suit,
Mm-hmm.
which is completely bananas.
Yep.
Um, And then of the nominees here, like I'm kind of surprised that most of these films even got recognized in this category. I'm stunned that anyone at the Academy watched this film. Like, did they get tricked into this? Like, what was the situation? I know that she won Best Actress at Cannes for this,
Right.
I believe.
Yep.
And she's kind of everywhere at that moment in time because Blow Up is out.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
You know, kind of iconic in
Having a
that.
good year.
So
Yeah.
she's having a great year. She's having like a breakout year, and who can't resist the narrative of the Redgrave sisters having their moment at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I love that it got nominated. I love that a bunch of people had to sit and grapple with this like satire slash comedy slash psychological breakdown that features like gorilla suits on fire and hammer and sickle rose gardens and something that is so genuinely demented. And that's my kind of favorite kind of film, to be honest. I hope that if you haven't seen any of the films, people who are listening to this, if you haven't seen any of these ones, I mean, you should watch them all anyway. But this one, track this one down because it is. I'm stunned they got made. This does feel like something that could have only happened at that moment in time when there was real reckoning with class in Britain, which we have just kind of decided to totally today. Like the British class system is an absolute poison here, especially in the entertainment industry.
Mm-hmm.
And you would never get to see a story like this, I think. Now, at least not something made with these kind of big stars. And I mean, they were huge at the time, but they're so iconic now. But someone who was seen as so proper as Vanessa Redgrave was at that time before she became known as like the political dilettante. See
Mm-hmm.
her, she doesn't get to let loose as much as Warner does. I don't think anyone in film that year got to let loose as much as David Warner does in this film.
Mm-hmm.
But it's such a fun, kind of seductive, emotionally, morally ambiguous kind of performance. She's toying with him, but like he loves it, but also does nasty things to her, and it's your sympathies really shift with this guy. I'm thinking about this one so much after I first saw it, so getting to rewatch it was like, yeah, this is still great.
Wow. Yeah, well, I mean, this film I think has been very polarizing, just from other people I've talked to who have seen this. It is a very bizarre movie, first of all, and a movie that, if I'm being completely honest, I did not even know what to think of as I was watching it, and still don't know what to think of having watched it. I think it gets better just the more absurd and out there it becomes over time by the end. I didn't really respond to the comedy of the film necessarily, so I'll just be right up front and say that. It's just one of those films where I wasn't really on the same wavelength of it. Maybe if I had a better understanding of what I was getting into, I think I would probably appreciate it more. Maybe on a second watch, I might appreciate it in that respect. But, by the end, when it becomes a little deeper, I think, in what it's all trying to say in some regard, I do appreciate it more. But I think Vanessa Redgrave is pretty good here. I don't really think of it as nomination worthy, if I'm being honest. I also don't think she's a lead. She's obviously the female lead.
I think this is fully supporting. Like, this is like, forget category fraud with Vida Kamińska, this is category fraud. And I think 100%. This is very much, well, isn't it cute that we can put the Redgraves together and also we are just not going to really care about Blow Up as an acting movie for some reason. Yeah. So it's weird that this is like the safer option, because I would have figured the audience would have responded far more easily to Blow Up than to this.
Yeah, it's true. It does feel pretty lopsided. I wish she had more to do, to be honest. I think just as an actress, she does have this kind of quiet force in a lot of her performances, and I think you definitely see the bones of that here when she is at first sort of trying to express her feelings for Morgan and how very complicated they are. But I think the material just kind of does her a disservice for the most part and doesn't really allow her to showcase her full range beyond just reacting to a lot of her the wackiness and showing some compassion for him. Like, it's not a bad performance necessarily by any means, but I guess I just find the Oscar nomination for it a little strange in a few regards. Like you're saying, like the fact that this was nominated at all and that Academy members watched it and actually marked their ballots for it is kind of a miracle. But I also think material wise, I wish I responded to it a little more, I guess. But Maybe you'll convince me. I don't know over the course of this conversation.
I do thoroughly agree that it is a supporting performance,
Yeah.
and the weird alchemy that must have gone on for this to get nominated. I mean, we don't usually think of like precursor awards at this stage. That really doesn't become a full thing until, like, I would argue, the 80s.
Right.
So like maybe they were influenced by the Cannes win. Even then, that feels like kind of a stretch.
Mm.
But this to me feels like kind of the true subversion of the swinging London scene. Like the swinging London scene kind of played at the idea that there was greater political freedom because you had this Labour government that was, decriminalizing homosexuality, and there was like near full employment for kids, for young people at that time. But and you get these sort of, the hip, which really doesn't kind of hit London at that time. Like that, the hippies don't really come for a few years, and they really don't arrive in most of Britain. Like what's happening in London is not happening in the rest of the UK. This doesn't come to Scotland, not even close.
Yeah.
We don't get any of that stuff for a long time.
Right.
But to see this film that is genuinely really politically challenging, like he's a communist, and the way he's kind of playing out his relationship with his rich wife, who he is fully still financially and emotionally dependent on, and she's aware of that, and the way that dynamic kind of works out between working in upper classes, that it could have been so didactic, and I think the film is having too much fun for it to play out like that, and the fact that your sympathies are sort of moving around so much with Morgan, and I think that they play out with Vanessa Redgrave too. It's very easy to feel sympathetic for her, given how it's just like constantly trying to ruin her. The things this man does to her, like that involve explosives, that involve kidnapping, that involve gate crashing events. Like so much. But it's so fascinating to watch the glimmer in her eye. She kind of likes that he's throwing himself at her feet constantly.
Yeah.
Is she like the perfect woman in this one, or is she just another example of like a rich girl who's getting to toy around with the working classes in her own way? I don't think that the film takes the easy way out, even though it is more politically likely to lean towards Morgan than her. I don't think it's a communist film by any stance. I think it is more that this sort of awareness of class that's going on in British film at the time. This isn't a Ken Loach film, but it does have that kind of edge to it. Like, what is it actually like to be in this supposedly free swinging decade, and actually you really don't have that many options? And that doesn't even get into mental illness. This is obviously not a great time in terms of healthcare for mentally ill. Psychiatry is very much viewed with suspicion. There's huge anti-psychiatry movements in Britain around this time. It takes a very long time for them to kind of acknowledge that maybe psychiatry could be a good. A lot of people are still dealing with that, actually. So I think that's one of the. I'm also a sucker for films that have too much going on rather than not enough.
This certainly has a lot of that.
Like, and there's a lot going on here. It's kind of like, one of the reasons I love and I'm fascinated by Spike Lee so much is every film he makes, he treats it like he's never going to get to make another film. So he has to put in every single idea he has right there and then. I think Jordan Peele is kind of like this with his films. I think that's one of the reasons Nope is so fascinating. And there's a kind of a sense of that with Carol Rice here. Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which he makes before this, is far more straightforward as exploration of the working classes, and it's great. Everyone should watch it. I mean, Albert Finney is phenomenal in that film, but this one has really one of its lofty ambitions. I think it's too anarchic to be kind of aiming for prestige, which once again makes it so fascinating that people even kind of acknowledge this as a film. Thank you for doing so, obviously. But I totally get why this is not for a lot of people, and I think a lot of humor is very British, and I would say watching this with a crowd really helped for me. Like, I watched this with friends.
Yeah, I could see that.
And they were all totally, like, on the level with it. But it is prickly, and all of the performances are very prickly. Like, Vanessa Redgrave in this is very sharp-edged. She's not easy necessarily to like, especially when you compare it to what her sister is doing in Georgy Girl, where you embrace Georgie so wholeheartedly. You do not do that with Leonie. This, basically a bored rich girl who is, doesn't have to make any decisions in her life because she can afford not to, which Morgan can't.
Yeah, exactly. And I will just say that I appreciate what you're talking about there with the amount of ideas that this film has, and that sort of complex struggle, not only between these two characters, but just the two different systems that are at the heart of the film. I do think it was quite fascinating to explore. And that's the part of the film that I do enjoy. It's just, I guess, style wise, it's just not really my thing, to be honest. So that's the only reason. Like, just, it sounds stupid, but just on a surface level reading of the film, it's not a film that I would naturally be drawn to necessarily, but I like the ideas behind it. And I think her performance, it's more complex than it might seem on the surface. And even though I don't necessarily find it to be super nomination worthy, maybe if it wasn't supporting actress, I would feel better about it, I guess. But there is just kind of like a refined quality about her. But there is also, like you said, that glimmer in her eye. Like, even when she's very shocked when she sees, like, he put a skeleton in her bed. But then she also has this kind of like cavalier attitude about it after she confronts him about it. Like, yes, she's disturbed, but also she's used to this at the same time, and this might be why she's divorcing him in the first place. But it's also like, wow, I'm impressed that you pulled off such a grand stunt just for me. And there's another scene shortly after that where she's driving with her new guy, and they see Morgan, and she seems a little too excited to see him, and just by the prospect of these two men fighting over her, which is, I think, a really nice touch of her showing how, even though she's turned off by some of his behavior, maybe even most of the time, there is still something there between them that she can't quite shake.
My hope is that at some point in the future, there will be a really like major retrospective of Carol Rice in general. Because I find just watching all of his films, almost all of his films in a really short space of time, kind of drove home this particular sort of director that we don't really acknowledge in wider conversations about film, which is someone who is not necessarily a journeyman, but someone who has that kind of malleability where they can tackle so many different themes and so many different styles so well that you kind of take them for granted. They're not necessarily given auteur status. Like, if you haven't seen this, go see it. Go watch The French Lieutenant's Woman, which should be awful, frankly, and it's brilliant. Go watch Who'll Stop the Rain, which is one of the most sinfully underrated films of its era. It's also weirdly one of these films that my friends and I kind of watch all the time. I don't know how it got into our rotation. It's Nick Nolte and Tuesday Weld, and it's like a crime drama with a sort of hard-bitten post-Vietnam noir quality to it. And yes, it does feature the Creedence song. If you want to see more of Vanessa Redgrave, watch Isadora, where she plays Isadora Duncan. I imagine you're going to be doing that soon.
We'll talk about on the show, right?
I just love the idea of people going to watch this after they've been to see, like, The Russians Are Coming, in Hawaii, which is a terrible movie.
Hawaii, yeah.
Bless.
Yeah.
Poor Julie Andrews.
I know. But Vanessa Redgrave, I think my favorite parts of the performance are that sort of edge of really being kind of turned off by him, but also being kind of turned on by him all at the same time. And just over time, like after she's been kidnapped and that whole thing has gone down, we see some of her compassion and her love for him when he just says that he's scared. You know, there's this really gentle sort of warmth that she brings to it in that moment that I think really made it all click into place for me about why she sticks by him for as much as she wants to move on with her life. Because I think she also just wants to help him and be taken care of, you know, and that he can't really help himself. And there is like that quiet, sort of powerful force that Vanessa Redgrave has in a lot of her performances that I do think registers in those moments here towards the end. Even when the film isn't on the whole giving her a lot to do, she does try to make the most of what she gets.
I totally get in the sense like how you could watch this and be like, this woman is going to be a star, but I am much better if you've already seen Blow Up.
Right.
And what will come later, and the sort of expectation will come later. And also, you know, she's from an acting dynasty, and they love that.
Oh,
you know, we get into the nepotism baby conversation now, but you know, it was a very different breed of nepotism back in the day. Exactly. You know, I would never deny either Redgrave a career. Sorry for my hypocritical this conversation, but how could you deny just the absolute nature that she would, especially the way that she would later become? I mean, I think you see some of that in Era, which she's playing. I mean, it's a biopic, but it's not really a traditional biopic.
Yeah.
If you got a really bananas Isadora Duncan movie, watch the short one that Ken Russell made, where they're all like half-naked women running down the hill together. It's great. But I can't be mad at this nomination, even if I do think it's technically supporting.
Mm-hmm.
She wouldn't be my win. I'm just so glad that she's here. Like, I'm more likely to be sympathetic towards a nomination, and it's like this otherwise probably never would have happened.
Yeah,
And the
that's
fact that
fair.
this happened had to have been, the stars must have had to align in a really specific manner for this to happen.
Yeah, maybe also just a little bit of ambivalence with some of the other leading Hollywood contenders and productions because I mean, you look at this lineup and it's like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is the only one that's like a traditional Hollywood production. So what
Yeah,
does
all
that
the
say?
big kind of nominees for are mostly kind of male sausage fest, to be honest, which I don't imagine helps matters. Oh God, that's never happened since. We're so glad we moved on from that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but if it people to take a risk, that's great because frankly, more often than not, they don't.
Yes.
And how many years have we had the conversation where there's quote unquote not enough women to fill out a category, and it's just because they're not looking farther than the six biopics or roles where she's a wife to a great man or something like that.
Yes.
But I think we can make that argument for maybe this year's big one. There was a lot of people that missed out the year before. I mean,
Hmm.
frankly, more often than not, I
There
think you
always
could make
is.
this
There always
argument
is.
with women.
Yep. It's time for Liz. Here we go. All right. Elizabeth Taylor in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So excited to be talking about this performance, but also a little sad that this is my last Elizabeth Taylor. This is her fifth and final nomination, her second win after Butterfield 8. So we've been alluding to what Elizabeth Taylor has been up to over the past few episodes since the last time she won. She gets together with Richard Burton. They make Cleopatra together, the notorious Cleopatra, and the two of them were just the it couple of the moment, and they made film after film together. They did The VIPs, The Sandpiper, and then Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is based on a very famous Edward Albee play. They apparently originally wanted Bette Davis and James Mason for the lead roles, but they opted for just the major star power of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton in a kind of stunt casting sort of way. And she was originally thought to be a little miscast, considering she was still pretty young here, only 32, playing middle aged, but it obviously worked out for her. So the film is about a middle aged married couple, George and Martha, played by Richard Burton and Liz Taylor. He's a college professor. She is the daughter of the college president. So they're very influential people, but they also often get into arguments with each other. And one night they host a get together with a new biology professor, Nick, and his wife, Honey. And the night descends into chaos, to put it lightly. So let's talk Liz Taylor. Very curious what your thoughts are on her as an actress and what you think of her here in this Oscar winning performance.
I don't think there's anything I can say about Liz Taylor that would even remotely capture the magnitude of her career and her talent and just what she meant. I mean, I think when you think of star, she is kind of the first one that comes up, and rightly so. I actually recently read a really interesting book about the making of Cleopatra written by its producer,
Oh boy.
and it came out. It's written by it's written by Walter Wanger or
Oh.
Vanger, I should say, and it was written before it was released before the film came out. So it's full of all these quotes where it's like, "Don't worry, I maintain it will be the greatest film of all time, and will make it than any other film." And then of course the film comes out.
Yeah.
But I'm really fascinated by like when major stars have their so-called flop era, because I tend to find a lot of the
Yes.
most work is in there, and this isn't really part of that. I think this is the beginning of her kind of fading out and making way for the younger generation. But then she goes on to films like Reflections in a Golden Eye and Boom and Secret Ceremony
Mm-hmm.
and the driver's. It's called Identikit, but it's the adaptation of Muriel Sparks' and Driver's Seat, and it's amazing, and no one talks about it. Um, she never really lost that talent. It took a long time for people to kind of acknowledge that she actually was a great actress because she also happened to be the most beautiful woman who ever lived.
Right.
Um, so it's really interesting to see her in Virginia Woolf. I mean, we've been talking for 2 hours about these very unconventional Oscar performances, these very unconventional actresses. And then the winner of the evening is someone who I think is putting on what we would expect from an Oscar performance.
Right.
She puts on weight. She looks much older than she was. She's a star. She's yelling. She gets all these big dramatic moments. And yet I wouldn't deny her that win for the world. I think she is genuinely that brilliant in it.
Yeah, this is an iconic performance with a capital I. It's hard not to be kind of obsessed with what she's doing in this film. I think this is a very clearly like a dream role for an actress because Martha is such a complicated and flawed character with a lot of trauma in her past, and she uses that to basically inflict her feelings on other people. And there is yelling and screaming and crying and quieter moments, also drunk acting. It has everything in the book, and it's such rich material, I find, that never feels stuffy or even overly written, even though it is a very dialogue driven, obviously based on a play, very dialogue driven film. And it feels pretty realistic, almost in an uncomfortable way. Like you're kind of spying on these two couples who are really just hashing everything out, all the ugly little details of their past and how they got to this point. And it also just has this refreshing blend of comedy too that I think all four of the actors here really excel at, and they all work in tandem so perfectly that it's like nothing is out of place. But for as much as I love the kind of droll internal work that Richard Burton is doing, or the kind of innocent but not really type of thing that George Segal is doing, or the very eccentric, like not like anyone else energy that Sandy Dennis brings to it, this is the Elizabeth Taylor show for me. Like she is just the
Oh, and
center of
she
everything.
knows it.
Yes, she
She
owns it.
absolutely. There's a great quote from the review from the Hollywood Reporter at the time that said that Miss Taylor is a prime reason the film feels so seldom a drama and almost always an invasion of privacy, a
Right.
violation of privacy. I should say, like you really do get the sense that you're watching something you're not supposed to be watching,
Yeah.
with this deeply broken and abrasive woman who is exhausting to be around, but kind of enthralling at the same time. She's very funny. I mean, she's mean. She's a really mean drunk. Also, side note, this is a great like boozy performance, especially given that she's going up against one of the great boozy actors, boozy people of that time.
Yeah.
I mean, bless Richard Burton on and off the stage when it came to his drinking,
Mm-hmm.
but it is entirely her show. I mean, you do obviously need what Burton's bringing to it. Virginia Woolf is an interesting play in that regard. You can it's primarily played as you would see it here, where Martha is entirely the one with the power. She is the browbeater. She's the one that kind of needs to be taken down a peg. You can do that very differently. I know there was a Broadway version a few years ago where Tracy Letts was George and he kind of was the force of nature instead, which I wish I could have seen that. That would have been really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Could never imagine them trying to make Liz Taylor come second in this.
No.
And she did great work with Richard Burton. If you haven't seen the very strange film Boom with an exclamation point at the end, it's an adaptation of a very bananas Tennessee Williams story, and Noel Coward is in it for some reason. Bananas, amazing. She's great in it, and it is that kind of like the kind of eccentricity you get with a true D. But here, this is exhaustively real in a way. I mean, even though she gets in some great quips, and there is still like it's still very theatrical. I was really excited to revisit and just see that it didn't feel like trapped by the theatrical elements of it. I mean, maybe it's also because I've recently seen The Whale, and that film very much is stuck by that.
Oh,
Not to
God.
compare
Yeah.
Edward Albee to that
Yeah.
that thing, which we
I
won't get
agree.
into. That's a
I
whole other
agree.
issue.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, mercy there. It's just, oh God.
Yeah.
I'm steering away from that. Don't worry, I'm moving away from that.
Yes, thank you.
I never Mike Nichols be able to do this from basically off the bat.
First film.
I haven't read Mark Harris's book about him yet.
It's so
read
good.
It because
it's really good. Yeah.
But I think there's something. I totally get why this film ended up getting nominated in every eligible category, which I think is the first time that happened since like the 30s.
Right.
But I also get why a lot of people must have felt very turned off by it because it doesn't win Best Picture, it doesn't win Best Director. Right. It misses out on a lot because they went for, I think, what they imagine to be a bit more quaint, which is Man for All Seasons, which is not a bad movie. I'm not knocking it a lot in this podcast. It's just that I get why you would probably come out of Virginia Woolf and feel like you needed to be like calmed down a little bit, almost.
You need a cold shower. Yeah.
But because you need a cold shower. You probably need whatever alcohol Liz Taylor is knocking back in
or
this.
that. Yeah, definitely.
I gotta say, I did really think because she's so young in this. It's so I usually get mad at this sort of thing. A 5-year-old having to play a grandmother with I usually hate that.
Yeah.
It didn't bother me for a second here. I think that
no, me neither.
she feels so beaten down. To see one of the most beautiful women of all time just seem like she's been through the ringer for decades, has kind of pickled herself in her own bitterness. I totally bought it.
Yeah. I think despite being what some would have said was miscast, I do think she works perfectly for this role, especially in seeing her dynamic with Richard Burton, which is so lived in, and you can feel the history of their relationship in a sense, both on and off screen, like them as just people in the world, but also these characters. And I love how we see over time that I think the reason why Martha is the way that she is because she has this privilege as the daughter of a very influential man, and she knows that she has that power. And she also comes from a sort of academic background, so there's a sharpness and there's a quickness to her that's mixed in with that almost spoiled sense of self that she has. But then you also see just the pain of how this relationship is soured so much and how they both have this kind of weight on them that has to do with children, as we know, comes into play towards the end. And you see all the just layers in how she carries herself, her confidence, the way she totally owns a room. And it feeds into everything I love about Elizabeth Taylor, which is just her confidence that is so apparent in certain roles. Not every role is a winner for her, but I think this one is by far her best performance in her entire career.
Yeah, I think that I mean, it's so interesting to see her to get to be a performance and not a star as well. And I think that's so much of what her career is her having to balance out. You know, she
Yeah.
has to be incredibly glamorous and also a good actor. Look at something like Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, you know,
Yeah, totally.
agonizingly beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
or Butterfield 8, which is a terrible movie, but you know she is great in it while also having to be so beautiful. Like, oh my god, it must be so difficult being so pretty. Actually, it was for her. Like when remember when she eat and like everyone was horrendous to her,
Mm-hmm.
and then she ended up turning it into a diet book. The diet book is really funny if you haven't read it. The recipes are bananas. There's one recipe that's just get a steak and smear it with butter. I don't know how that helps, but for someone who had such an fascinating control over her image, and it often lost, you don't have to wrestle it back to see her decide the best way that I can really put myself to work and show how good I am is to do what is unbearable cliche, but it must be so radical at the time for an audience who knows Liz Taylor as you know the most beautiful woman in the world to see her look so broken, to look so like life has just given up on her entirely. Like she's never have been looked at like she was beautiful. Although, you know, you also see the kind of disintegration of what it's like to be have been somebody and lose that. I think is so well done. It's weird to me that I've heard people like talk about actresses of eras and they like, oh, there's like very kind of stiff performances and not real kind of acting as what we would know now. And you know, this era of acting that's coming in post Brando, post Montgomery Clift, post studio system really makes shifts away from the kind of stuff that made her a star to begin with. But she's keeping up here. I mean, she's in many ways leading that charge. It's kind of a shame that she didn't get more to do with after Virginia Woolf, although I would argue that stuff like Reflections of Golden Eye are fascinating failures, if nothing
Mm-hmm.
else. You know, I would love to have seen her, work with a Carol Rice, frankly, to be honest, or do more with Mike Nichols, or
Totally.
what
Yeah.
would the people doing the hot young movies of the 70s have done with Liz Taylor, because once again, she wasn't old.
Right.
She's in her early 30s here. I think she's younger in this one than I am now, which is a little depressing.
She is 32 years old in this film. Yeah, which
Okay,
is
she's the same age as I am. I'm not
so me too. I am also
but
32. So
that's still
that's
depressing.
just like shocking to me. Yeah.
So we could be really depressed together about this. I
Yeah.
respect that.
Suddenly we're in the scenario where we are the same age as Elizabeth Taylor was and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and we have to reckon with that. But anyway, yeah, I think she is so in the pocket here, really in every single scene in terms of intention and just attacking her lines so well and knowing exactly what Edward Albee is intending for them. And she's again so comfortable with Richard Burton and the rhythms they have together from knowing each other for years. that even in their first argument just establishes their whole dynamic, and you feel like you're seeing how they might really be like, where she's kind of like busting his balls and he's kind of clueless, and she's just kind of, talking with her mouth full of food, and there's kind of that physicality to the performance that it doesn't feel like, to your point, the idea of like a movie star kind of thing. It feels just like this is a character role, and she's taking it on with full force, just like all of the other people like Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando would have done. That's what this feels like to me. And, even like in terms of the comedy of the film, I think she lands so many of the sort of punchlines there, slapping his back as she's massaging him and she's singing Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and just being like totally sloppy. And it's like she just has such presence and such venom in her voice in so many scenes. But then it's like with a funny little turn of phrase between the two of them, they can just dissolve into loving each other again and laughing with each other. And that's the part of it that really feels like you see why these two connected when they were younger, because they're kind of just on the same wavelength, and they are so equally matched to each other that it becomes fun and games for them, even if outside people like Nick and Honey at the beginning might be horrified by what they're seeing. They are such clear partners together. For as much as they drive each other crazy, they are each other's crazy.
Yeah, I think if you're going to drag someone to hell with you, it might as well be someone who is probably going to appreciate the ride. And you do get that sense with George and Martha.
She gets to do everything with this role, from the comedy to the drama, which I think she really excels at as well. Like when Honey asks when their son is coming home after having brought him up before, there's like this dark cloud that comes over her where it's like the entire temperature of the room shifts. And I love those moments where we cut through the bullshit of the fun and games of it all, and it really is just having to confront the very ugly truth of this relationship and the sort of secrets and the lies that they tell each other to make themselves feel better over time. That part of it is always something that really sneaks up on me, even having watched this film multiple times. For as much as we love the sort of revelry and the fun and games that she brings to it, that darkness that seeps in, I think, is the most effective part of the performance, especially, of course, when we get to the end and things really have simmered and she just has to grapple with the fact that this sort of dynamic of lying about their son is now having to come to an end, essentially. Like they've killed the bit. Like, we just have to reckon with the truth of it all. And those quiet final moments, I think, are so beautiful for her. And she earns it. She earns it all the way through the end.
And it's such a blessing to watch this. I mean, there's just something about watching someone who's very good at her job be even better at it.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think she ever got to be better than this. And there's competition for that. I mean, I do think stuff like Cat on a Hell Turned Roof comes really close, but I think there's just something so natural about this that I want more of, and we didn't really get more of it. I mean, and there's great fun in a lot of those later performances. Like in Boom, she goes back to Diva Liz, which is a blast.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're going to end on the high walls, this is kind of the way to do it, I think.
Definitely. To go back to the final moments of her telling him, like pleading with him, you can't kill him, you can't let him die. And then, Nick and the rest of the audience kind of realizing what the truth of the matter is, that this person never existed. It's really quite haunting. And again, her sort of stunned silence towards the end and gradually accepting that they have to move on. And when she says, like, just us, like having to reckon with the fact that it's just going to be her and George, and they can't keep up the lie anymore, is something that sticks with me to this day. And it's another one of these performances where in my mind's eye I can see so many shots and choices that she makes that just stick in my mind for whatever reason, because of how distinct they are and how full force she is with this performance and this character. So needless to say, I love it. I'm obsessed with it. I'm so glad that she got this final nomination and win. And I think, unless you want to talk about anything else with the performance, we can discuss why it is that she won this Oscar.
I think the only thing it is, I think it's also like the ultimate boss move to just not go pick up your second Oscar.
That's
I
true.
mean, I assume she had some sort of conflict, like of schedule or something. Everyone else is up in their glad rags. She gets a huge applause, and it's like, I don't even need to be there. You know,
Well,
to me, that's power.
there is a reason that she didn't show up, which is that apparently Richard Burton, who was also nominated, was afraid of flying and did not want her to fly alone. So that's it.
That's almost cute from Richard Burton. I didn't know he had it in him.
Yeah. So there you go. And then after she did win, she was almost like incensed that Richard had lost for that at that point was his fifth time. And she refused to thank the Academy because of that.
Like, I mean, in terms of like the Great Hollywood Marriages, total mess, but still
Total mess.
fascinating.
Exactly.
Still beautiful in its own way.
Yes. Beautiful, messy, tragic. And in terms of the race itself, we can talk a little bit about what precursors there were in 1966, where Vanessa Redgrave, as we discussed, had won at the Cannes Film Festival. Ida Kamińska had won a special mention award actually at Cannes in 1965, so that was something the year before at least. And Lynn Redgrave won the New York Film Critics in a tie with Elizabeth Taylor, actually. And Lynn Redgrave also won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Comedy. Anouk Aimée actually won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Drama. So, all of them were nominated for Golden Globes together. And so they at least all had some kind of presence before the Oscars, so they were in the discussion. And one very funny quote that I read was another one from Lynn Redgrave, who was really just feeling herself because she said, and this is from Inside Oscar, "Sure, Liz has something going for her after that marvelous performance, but I wouldn't be surprised if I were given the Academy Award. Liz isn't unbeatable." Which,
We need more quotes like that. Like, bring that age back. Like,
truly,
let's get some shit stirring.
yeah. Like, I was talking about this with some of my Twitter followers the other day because I posted this quote. And it's just imagine it being like Andrea Riseborough being like, Kate, great performance. I don't think she's unbeatable, though. I think I have a chance.
They've already positioned her as like the unfair villain of this season. She should just go full, like,
Embrace it. Yeah.
full drama. Put on like another haircut that will make you completely unrecognizable and just go
Yes.
for
Oh
it.
my
No one
God.
will know it's you.
No one will know. I know. But anyway, why do we think Liz Taylor was our big winner here? Do we think it's just the fact that it was like the most traditional performance? Is it just love for her? They didn't have to give her a second Oscar, but they did. What advantages did she have over these other four?
I think it's a combination of being the star in the category, having the big role, having her film be nominated in every category it's eligible for, and the fact that it's just so undeniable. I mean, it does occasionally happen. They do pick the performance that deserves it the most. And we talked about like a lot of these performances as wonderful as they are, it can be hard to point to a specific scene and be like, this is why it was nominated.
Right.
Here's the bit that everyone is talking about. And I think over the decades, that kind of attitude hasn't really changed all that much.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly doesn't hurt that she's still Liz Taylor, that she is still can command the attention of everyone in the room, regardless of what's going on. But this is also a chance for her to be, I think, remind people that she was an actress, because at this time every headline is about her marriage to Richard Burton. Every headline is about drama. It's about fights. It's about diamonds. It's about her getting old at the ripe old age of 32, never getting over that.
God.
So I think there's something about like the kind of I'm back bitch moment where you're like, actually I'm better than all of you at this and I'm gonna prove it to you. And what a way to do it, because the expectations for this role are high. I mean, it was a very popular play, but it was one that was seen as being kind of unadaptable. It was seen as there's no way you'll be able to get away with making this film in Hollywood and not having to completely strip it down. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that it is actually as close to the source material as it is, it's kind of a miracle, and all the drama they had around making sure they could keep all the dirty language in it, which seems really tame now, but Hump the Hostess had them in knots back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can see them going for like the wrong reasons of a performance, but it all works out kind of right. But sometimes it's just undeniable. And I really look at that decade and think, that's the performance to me that I'm like, yeah, I will revisit that one over and over again. I will recommend it to my friends, and it has stood the test of time. I think that's another thing as well, as people look back on that film so fondly, they look back on that performance so fondly. I think in many ways that film kind of lays a path for what's to come with, obviously The Graduate's just around the corner. A lot of those films that frankly didn't have a lot of great performances for women. This is kind of an exception.
Mm-hmm.
They were really more concerned with guys.
Yeah.
um,
Oh, yeah.
but she's just really is killer in it, and especially when you think they didn't have to. I mean, how often has it happened where someone, they didn't give Julie Christie her second Oscar for Away from Her, before you totally should have.
Hmm.
They didn't, give an Oscar to Emmanuelle Riva when it was, a nice elderly lady giving beautiful heartfelt performance. They never usually do. I mean, I think the cutoff for most of these women is kind of what, 28 for a
Yeah.
win.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look at the average age of Best Actress wins, it's so much younger than Best Actor wins. It's actually really embarrassing.
Yeah.
Not that she's bucking a
Not
journalist,
lately
she's
though,
32.
I will say. Not lately, which is good.
It has gotten somewhat better
Yeah.
recently. God,
Just
women in their
saying.
50s still exist as long as they still look 32.
Well,
That's
well,
another
there you
argument
go.
for another day.
I guess,
But
yeah.
I I can't be mad at winning. I don't know anyone who could be. I mean, frankly, and I say this as someone who's very fond of all of the performances in that category. And I think if any of the other ones would have won, there may have been conversations over the years about, well, it probably should have been Liz's. But the work does speak itself there. It's just that Liz's is better.
Yeah, I think it is definitely just an undeniable performance. And all due respect to Lynn Redgrave, I don't think Liz was unbeatable, as she said. I think
No, I think that it's very sweet of her to have that confidence, but no,
sure,
surely not.
right. I just feel like she probably got the lion's share of votes here, would be my guess. It is the most traditional dramatic performance in this category. It's all of the things that they love. It's her showing a somewhat different side to her, even though she certainly had laid the tracks for, being able to pull off a performance like this with some of her work in the Tennessee Williams adaptations and whatnot. But I just feel like this was one of those wow moments where it's like, we did not know you were capable of this. We are going to give you another one. And even though we already gave you one in 1960, it's like, oops, like maybe we did it too soon because this is like really what you're capable of. So I think there's that. There's the fact that she's the only Hollywood person in this group and certainly the most familiar to most members, probably every single member voting in the Academy. And so it's just the perfect storm for her also being in the most nominated film of the year, nominated in every single category. Yeah, there was no way she was ever going to lose this. But in our last segment, we will be trying to figure out who was the possible runner-up to Liz. But we'll put a pin in that. And let's get to a handful of Twitter questions before we wrap up. E. Merman's Purse said, "Is this the biggest landslide of the decade?" So I assume that's in response to her winning. I would imagine it was. Right?
At least in this category. I mean, I can't see.
Yeah, I think that's what it implies. Yeah.
Like who is? I mean, yeah. I'm looking at the category now, Kate. Like including Liz Taylor's first one in 1960. Now, I think that this must have been easy for people to rally around that way for all the reasons that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I would have to look at probably every other category to make that decision otherwise. But at least in terms of Best Actress, like I don't think anyone else even looks like. And this is the first ever tie we get, so we definitely know that wasn't a landslide.
Right.
And especially in competition, people like Maggie Smith winning, but she has tough competition. Katharine Hepburn winning has tough competition for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Yeah, this is. In terms of ones I would love to see the numbers on, I think this would be a big one because I really do feel like she must have run away. Not just because she's so excellent in it, but I don't know who like the second pick would be in that sense that people would rally around.
Right. Exactly.
And we'll get to that later, obviously. Right. But who do you make your case for? Because they're compelling cases, but getting people to care about them, that's a whole.
That's the problem.
Whole other kettle of fish.
I don't know if there's a super compelling, like obvious alternative here. I could see the camp being like through all these 4 different other performances here. I could have seen camps for. So she was the runaway. It's kind of like Olivia de Havilland did The Heiress that year. I think is very similar to this. Fritz said, did any of Liz's previous nominations prepare you for this? Well, it is obviously a film that I've seen before, so, it wasn't a case of me really building up to this performance, but in terms of, like, being a person in 1966, I don't think really any of her other previous performances probably would have prepared the audience for this. Maybe Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, but otherwise, yeah, I think that's a big part of why she won, is that they were really surprised by what she was capable of.
Yeah, I didn't see this as my like. I think this is one of my earlier Liz ones. I didn't
Yeah,
see
same.
like Suddenly Last Summer until I'd already seen Virginia. But it's an interesting game of contrasts.
Yeah.
But I knew, I definitely knew what she was capable of. I think you do see like the roots of Virginia Woolf in something like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I mean, just her ability to deal with very theatrical language. She always had a good hold on that. I've never seen Raintree County, I should say. That's the one of her nominations
Yeah.
I haven't seen.
It's not good.
I can't say I'm rushing out to see it, but
Yeah. No.
It's really fun to see the difference between a star and an actor.
Yeah.
So I think that's really with that sort of contrast of Oscar nominations for her.
Definitely. Christoph said, is Taylor and Burton the best example of stunt casting that actually worked so much better than people had any right to believe? And also, do you sometimes think about the alternate timeline in which Bette Davis wins her third Oscar for Virginia Woolf?
It's interesting. It's so fascinating that Bette Davis was like the choice by Edward Albee because like there is the Bette Davis joke at the beginning of it. What a dump. It would be really interesting to hear her say that again.
Yes.
I get why you would want this in this. You definitely see like there's a lot of her performance of human bondage in this character in that sense. What is it like to deal with someone who is just so off-putting, but also like horribly human? Can't say that I yearn for it. I think that what we have is so excellent.
Yeah.
Stunt casting, it's a very good one, definitely. I mean, it helped that they had the goods to back it up. I mean, Richard Burton was already a celebrated Shakespearean actor by that point in time. I'm trying to think of what else I would think of in terms of stunt casting, though. Because it's a tough thing to pull off,
Yeah.
And I think we don't really deal with that so much nowadays, at least unless it's in like little cameos or something, because every major part is sort of like chosen by committee now. There's no choice for it to be a stunt. It's all too perfectly planned.
Yeah, exactly. But yes, I think if Bette Davis is in this part, she is 100% winning her third Oscar for this. So it's just a different version of what we get, but still probably would have been very, very undeniable, I would imagine.
I imagine the power balance would have been so fascinating with James Mason.
I know. Oh my God.
Having just watched the beginning of Georgy Girl, like I think that there was a really interesting malice and a kind of cunning you could have got with James Mason.
Yeah.
That is an interesting one.
Yeah. What could have been? Andrew Carden said, do you think Liz deserved any Oscar nominations post Virginia Woolf?
I mean, I am on the record as loving Boom. It's not just me. John Waters also loves it. If you won't listen to him, listen to John Waters.
There you go.
I don't know if it's necessarily Oscar worthy. I think that's another thing is like they did seem like they kind of gave up on her.
Yeah, that's the trouble.
She does interesting work, but it's often like Secret Ceremony, genuinely bananas film that she is captivating in. But I think it's another example of just an actress who kind of got left by the wayside when she was seen as having had her quote unquote time.
Yeah.
So that sucks for her, unfortunately.
Shout out to the Flintstones, her last movie. I know the Razzies nominated her for that, which is rude, but I think she just didn't really have something to match Virginia Woolf after this.
What she should have won an Oscar for is that clip of her saying "marriage, no,"
oh
because it is beautiful, and I think about it often. That's my philosophy for marriage. I didn't have to marry 8 times to get to that. No offense, Liz.
There you go. She provided that for you. Or her announcing Gladiator at the Golden Globes.
Oh, beautiful.
What an icon. Fritz said, this is Elizabeth Taylor's last nod, so please rank her 5 nominations. So this was very easy for me, to be honest. For better or for worse. Number 1 with a bullet, who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Number 2, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Number 3, Suddenly Last Summer. Number 4, Butterfield 8. And number 5, Raintree County. Boom. Done.
That's my exact ranking, to be honest. I mean, having not seen Raintree County, but like...
Just take my word for it.
Everyone was extremely everyone was extremely aware of the fact that Butterfield 8 was them realizing we've now gotten it out of our system that we've called her a slut and she almost died. Maybe we should feel a little bit sorry for that.
Right.
Should have gone to Shirley MacLaine for the apartment. We all understand that. We all know that. Liz Taylor knew that.
Me too. And I said it on that show. So there you go. Yep.
I think that's another reason that it's just so heartening for her to get this win, is it just feels like it's nice of you to make the right decision for the right reasons.
Exactly.
Because it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, we celebrate that, and especially for someone who was so deserving of it.
Right. Miles McHale said, Liz is stupendous, but picture it. A replacement in the Broadway production was Elaine Stritch. Could Elaine have brought some added verve and won an Oscar, too?
I mean, it would have been great if she'd been given a couple musical numbers, Sondheim style.
Oh, God. Yes.
I certainly see why that makes a lot of sense. You need that kind of like that dash of vinegar in the cocktail.
Oh, yeah.
For a performance like this. And Elaine Stritch had the most vinegar-ridden cocktail on New York stage.
It's true.
And we loved her for it.
Mm-hmm.
If they weren't going for stunt casting in the way that they did, which paid off marvelously, I could certainly see. I don't know if it would quite be the... If the category remains the same, except it's Elaine Stritch rather than Liz Taylor, I think she probably could win just from the sheer force of the performance.
Yeah,
and there would be that great narrative of, the one of the grand dames of the New York stage comes to Hollywood and nails it on her first go.
Right.
That's an interesting what if you put in my brain now. I'm just imagining Martha breaking out into Ladies Who Lunch while she's just pouring shit all over George's back.
I'll drink to that.
Bless Liz. It was the one thing she couldn't do was Sondheim musicals, because the Little Night Music version that she is in is not great.
Yeah. No, well, I think Elaine Stritch would have been dynamite. I would have loved to have seen that. And yeah, she probably would have won. Chelsea said, we've got a casting question here, which we always get, which I love. Dreamcast a new Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but nobody from Broadway. Very interesting caveat there. So because I saw this question ahead of time, I did write down my 4. It's kind of a strange 4 that I came up with, but I'll just see what you think of it. So because of her quickness and because I would just love it so much, and I honestly think it would be amazing to see it, for Martha, I have selected Jennifer Coolidge.
Hell yeah. Yes. I'm in.
Just give it to me. I don't even care. Let's see it. And if we're continuing to just do whatever the hell we want, for George, I'm putting in Mads Mikkelsen. Why not?
Yep. Once again, not mad at this. Very much not mad at this.
Okay, good. 2 for 2.
At the very least, we should get a Vanity Fair Hollywood issue photo shoot acting this out.
I would love that. Yes. For Honey, I went with Mia Goth.
Does she still have her regular haunted Victorian orphan accent, or does she have to go American for this?
She can do whatever Pearl sort of voice she wants. And then I truly had no idea what to do for Nick. I know that he is supposed to be like a Midwestern type, and because he was kind of sort of in the news recently with Sundance performance he had at Sundance, I said Alden Ehrenreich. I don't know how I came up with that, but there we are.
See, I like that choice.
Thank you.
Firmly team Alden Ehrenreich. I think he got screwed over by the mid-performance for Solo. I think he's great. I cannot wait for the comeback between Fair Play and Cocaine Bear. Let this man rise.
Preach. Yes. So that is my very odd combination that I came up with.
I wish I had time to prepare for this, so I'll give a couple ones I would love. For Martha, I'm going to say Sandra Hüller from Tony Erdmann and In the Isles.
Yeah.
I don't know how great her English language acting is, but I think that she could completely nail that. For George, I'm going to say Lars Mikkelsen.
Oh, okay. Keeping it in the
I've
family.
recently been watching. I'm watching Kingdom Exodus on Movie, which is the sequel to the 3rd season of Lars von Trier's Kingdom, and he's so much fun in it. But he's also got that one. He looks like such an army professor who's actually just a total weirdo freak, and I think that you kind of need that for George.
Yeah.
Again, I will also take the Vanity Fair photo shoot of this if that is also not available.
Definitely.
And for our sort of young couple, I do love the idea of Alden Ehrenreich. I kind of want to steal that, but I will go with James and I actually don't think she's a very good actress. I won't say her.
Okay.
Belle Powley, who I don't think has had a proper breakout role that she deserves.
Yes.
Or Haley Rue, I would also accept.
That would be very fun. Or have Jennifer Coolidge and Haley Lou Richardson. White
That would be
Lotus
so
reunion.
good.
Yes.
Yes, like this thing is, if Mike White is looking for like another project to do with Jennifer Coolidge post White Lotus season 2, like
Hmm.
get her that Martha style role. He's got it in him.
Yeah.
And now he's
And
at a point
she's
where
got
people
it
are
in
just
her.
flinging money at him.
Yeah.
And she's got it in her too.
Hmm.
Did you watch, I don't know if you watched Swan Song, the film with her and Udo Kier?
I did, yes.
She's
She's
so good in
great.
it.
Yeah,
Like I cannot wait for her to fully get into her like character actress ear. I mean, she's always been an incredible character actress, but I'm really excited for people to give her the chances that she's always been ready to do, you know?
definitely. Yeah.
It shouldn't all be left to Mike White and Christopher Guest, you know?
Right. Yes.
Let the men rest.
Right. Next question from Miles McHale. Anouk Aimée, her generation's Marion Cotillard? Question mark. In the sense that she's French, I guess. I mean, that's a very different performance in La Vie en Rose, if that's the comparison we're making, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure. What do you think of that comparison?
Yeah, I think that's maybe just because she's French. Marion Cotillard is certainly very capable of giving a performance like this.
Sure, yeah.
But when she got nominated, it was for a very traditionally Oscar film and a
Yes.
very traditionally Oscar performance that I don't think she should have won for. I think it should have gone to Julie Christie.
Wow.
So
Brave.
I see more of her in like 2 day. Is it 2 days, one night?
Yes.
The
Yep.
that kind of makes more sense to me. Like she is very capable of being that kind of actress, someone who
That's a good
has
point.
been taken down a peg by life, and someone who's just sort of trying to get by, no matter how much is flung or small or otherwise. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a really interesting era where you see like the Oscars kind of realizing that people can act in other languages,
How about
you
that?
know,
Yeah.
and you get to see people like Sophia Loren
Right.
rise
Mm-hmm.
out of it. So I am fascinated what it was that drew them to Anouk Aimée, other than her just being like astonishingly beautiful and talented. But
Yes.
sometimes that's all it takes. They
Well,
tend to prefer that kind of performance anyway from actresses who aren't necessarily performing in English, which I
right.
think is another reason that Ada Kaminska's performance is so unique in its nomination.
Joey Gentili has a pretty loaded question here, who said Ida Kamińska is clearly supporting, yet fantastic. Would she have won in supporting?
If there is that kind of runaway train element to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and Sandy Dennis still went, I don't know. Because that's the thing is, it's not like Virginia Woolf is not a sweep,
Right.
but this is still an academy that, in the handful of times it does nominate a performance that's not in English, it doesn't tend to give them the win.
Mm-hmm.
I think they'd given a win to Sophia Loren in 1962.
Yeah.
And it takes them a long time to get that again.
Mm-hmm.
And Sophia Loren was a mega star in a way that Ida Kaminska just never was and never really wanted to be.
Right.
So I don't think she would have.
Yeah.
I think she would have been very deserving if she had been put in supporting, not to dismiss Sandy Dennis, who I actually think is also really excellent in.
Mm-hmm.
Is able to shine against the Hurricane Martha, which is difficult for any performer to do.
Yeah.
The great actors have sunk like the Titanic in productions of Virginia Woolf because they haven't been playing Georgia Martha, and she doesn't.
Right.
So, and she gets to yell "Hump the hostess" with like real vim, which I love.
That's true.
So I think she
violence.
probably still would
have. Yeah. I think it would have been a closer race between her and Sandy Dennis, but Sandy probably still would have won. Dark Shaka said, if 1960s Hollywood remade A Man and a Woman and The Shop on Main Street, who would play the roles originated by Aimée and Kamińska? Well, first of all, I don't think that should have happened, so I'm glad it didn't. But I'm gonna go with, knowing Hollywood, like, what would have happened, it probably would have been Julie Christie in that role, would be my guess, in A Man and a Woman.
I definitely think they would have gone for that sort of hot young rising star in that aspect.
Yeah, but
honestly,
still
we talk
European.
about Bette Davis and Virginia Woolf. I could definitely see her like being pushed for the Kamińska role. But I think that she probably would have done it much more theatrically. But also, I think that any Hollywood version of that film would have been done in a really just like pig-headedly wrong way. So, just horrible image to put out in the world, them doing a version of this.
Yeah.
I definitely think that they would have been picking, the studio system's sort of at this point in time, but I think they would have tried to go big with their cast. They would have really wanted someone whose name they could put above the title. It probably wouldn't have been a supporting part if it had been a Bette Davis role either.
Right.
How dare you suggest that she be supporting? So
Right.
just be glad that didn't happen.
Definitely. The person I went for with this, again, should not have happened. Glad it didn't. But I just went with Gladys Cooper. Because she was the go-to older character actress of the time.
For when film or writer's busy, you know?
Right, exactly. So, moving on, Christophe said recast Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland in the roles played by the Redgrave sisters, and as a bonus, recast the Redgrave sisters in the roles played by Olivia and Joan in 1941.
I see Olivia being more Georgy Girl than Joan, I will say that.
Agreed. I think Olivia for Georgy Girl and Joan for Morgan makes a lot of sense. And then on the other
Yeah, I
side,
definitely think that Joan could have the like that kind of like spark in her eye of being bored yet fascinated by
right.
someone like Morgan.
Yeah. And then for 1941, I would probably do Lynn Redgrave in Hold Back the Dawn and Vanessa Redgrave in Suspicion.
Yeah, I think Vanessa makes more sense for Suspicion.
Yep.
Like
I could see her being a Hitchcock.
the idea of like
kind
glamour post is
Right.
also just really exciting.
Yes. Sammy Flower said, which of the two sisters in the same year duo has better overall nomination history pound for pound, Lynn and Vanessa or Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland? I mean, probably Joan and Olivia, just based on the number of nominations they got. I still haven't seen some of Vanessa's nominations, so I can't say for sure if she has the better record and whatnot, but, you know, Joan Fontaine has Rebecca, Olivia de Havilland has Gone with the Wind, she has The Heiress, she has her other win, which is To Each His Own, she has The Snake Pit, all great performances, so I would probably lean towards them for the moment.
Yeah, that just and just in terms of the sheer result of it all, I think that just makes more sense.
Yeah. Matt Stillman said, would the combined votes for the Redgraves been enough to defeat Taylor? No.
No.
Nope. I think the combined votes of the entire losing nominees would not be enough to beat Taylor, to be quite honest. Juan Carlos Ojano said, which Best Actress contenders do you think came close to getting nominated? Because having two non-English language performances nominated, in as much as I love it, speaks to how the Academy had to branch out of Hollywood just to complete this group of nominees. So just from looking at other awards in terms of who was in contention, we had Natalie Wood in This Property is Condemned, Elizabeth Hartman in You're a Big Boy Now, I guess Julie Andrews in Hawaii, maybe as an afterglow, I don't know. Would love to also say like Julieta Messina for Juliet of the Spirits. Yeah, I just think there weren't a lot of super strong Hollywood options this year, which is what forced them to actually branch out, you know?
But it is a very weird year because it's not a bad year in film. It's just another case of like, oh well, women are sort of, to the side, or at least in terms of American and British films. Bless if it had gotten desperate enough that they had to nominate Julie Andrews in Hawaii. That's no knock on her. It's just a terrible film.
Yeah.
Well, it did get a nomination for Art, which is a fascinating nomination because it was the first time they'd ever nominated an Indigenous performer
Yeah.
of any kind. Very interesting performance. It's a weird nomination in general. It's a weird film. It's like, oh, bless. There's just a lot going on there that never made a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess like who else are you looking at? Just looking at the list of films came out this year. I mean,
Yeah, it's kind of tough.
yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really think it might have been making the best of a not a great situation, but then the best ends up being fascinating in a way that you can't be mad at.
Right.
Because I want more categories like this, not because they're quote unquote out of other women's money, but
Mm-hmm.
because they are willing to take a risk and understand that what defines a great performance is so much more than what we often know.
Exactly. Juan Carlos Ojano said, which Best Actress years would you have personally preferred to see at least two non-English language performances nominated? So, I mean, as we've been saying, there should be more situations like this. Honestly, having watched more international films in recent years, I would naturally gravitate to A Modern Race. And, because it's sort of on my mind in terms of recency bias, I'm just going to say 2022 with Tang Wei and Decision to Leave, I think deserves to be nominated. And the lead of Santo Mare, Gosalagi Malanda. I think both would have been excellent nominees.
Yeah, I'm sort of more going towards modern as well because of what I've seen. I
Right.
definitely think of people like Renata Rensby not getting nominated for Worst Person in the World, which I totally would have given her a nomination for.
Totally.
I mean, I just remember like the acts of joy I let out when they nominated Penelope Cruz for Parallel Mothers because it seemed
Hmm.
like such an obviously great choice they were going to ignore, and they didn't.
Right.
So that was good. Um,
That's a perfect
I would love
example
to have
of.
seen Leia Seydoux get nominated this year, but no one paid attention to that. Any of the women that are in Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, which was my favorite film of last year,
Hmm.
I legitimately sobbed hysterically watching that movie. I think it's brilliant. I would love to have seen some nominees for that. I mean, there's the best thing is you could go through any year and be like, here's at least 3 or 4 nominees, and not just an actress. I mean,
Oh yeah.
I knew it wasn't going to happen this year, but I would have loved Franz Rukowski to get Great Freedom.
Oh yes, I love
Like
that
that's an
performance.
entirely like not worthy performance. I feel like one day that he might get in for a performance because I think his star is building in that way, but it'll probably be a bad English language movie. Um, Maybe it's that one he's doing with Pete Davidson. I don't know.
Wow.
Uh,
Okay.
so there's
Yeah.
so many choices to choose from, and it's great that we have so many
Mm.
nominations. Like I'm still
Hmm.
mad that Mads Mikkelsen didn't get nominated for another round.
Yeah.
I'm still mad that no one from Parasite got nominated.
Oh yeah.
Joanna Kulig from Cold War.
Yeah.
Um, what is the actress from A Fantastic Woman? Daniela Vega.
Hmm.
You know,
Great pick. Yep.
Sandra Hüller from Tony Erdmann and In the Isles. And yeah, I could be here all day. I'll stop now.
Yeah, honestly, like preach. Because I'm a big fan of all those performances. It's a shame that none of them were recognized, but they will live on. They don't need nominations, you know? So there
Again,
it
you'll
is.
get a bunch of Oscar fans who never shut up about how great you were and how you were totally robbed. And isn't that the real prize?
Then you're a real winner in that case. Yeah.
Yeah.
David Pusak said, "What do you think Lana Turner's chances were at getting a nomination for Madam X? It's easily one of her best performances, if not her very best, and is sadly forgotten about nowadays." I haven't seen it, unfortunately. I don't think she was really on the radar of getting a nomination, as far as I can tell. I don't know if there was still some lingering thoughts about her own personal life and the drama going on there. So I can't speak to it, unfortunately.
Yes, I think that was also, I mean, it wasn't just post the Johnny Stompanato murder that,
Yeah.
kind of hindered her in the eyes of like her own industry. They never really fully embraced her as an actress.
Yeah.
It was kind of a miracle that they sort of nominated her for Peyton Place
Hmm.
because she easily could have been nominated a couple of times beforehand. The fact that she was never nominated for The Bad and the Beautiful, the fact that she was never nominated for The Postman Always Rings Twice,
Right.
I think was a sign less of her ability as an actress and more the fact that they just kind of didn't want to have anything to do with her, really. They left her out to dry a lot of the time. It's fascinating. If you go back and read a lot of like the Hollywood magazines, the fan magazines of that era, they're usually very careful about like talking about certain stuff and their issues and things. They're so out in the open of just being like, God, this woman gets around, doesn't she? It's really strange.
Yeah.
This is for Lana again.
I know, truly. All right. Shall we get to our final segment?
Let's.
All right. Well, we will give our verdict now on who we think was the runner up to Miss Elizabeth Taylor. Kayleigh, who do you think was second place here?
This is tough because, like I said, I don't really think there is a consensus pick here, like who
No.
everyone who was somehow anti would rally for. If I'm going into purely in terms of what I think makes sense, as in I could see the narrative being formed around it, I'm going to say Annie
Mm-hmm.
because one, they tend to nominate at the time they were nominating mostly younger actors. Two, they were sort of more fully acknowledging foreign language cinema, and I think that A Man and a Woman is just an easier film to embrace than what Ida Kaminska had to do.
Yeah,
Um,
certainly.
and sometimes I think there is something to be said for the voters going for a film that they like. And I think that in case of what they are more likely to like out of those 4 films that aren't Virginia Woolf, this one makes more sense to me.
Yeah. For me, this was between Anouk Aimée and Lynn Redgrave. I don't really think Ida Kamińska and Vanessa Redgrave were quite in the hunt. Maybe I could be very wrong on that, but I just, for me, actually get the sense that the strength of the material is more on the side of Lynn Redgrave as the possible runner up here, who did tie with Elizabeth Taylor at the New York Film Critics, and she did win a Golden Globe. Not that precursors mean as much then as they do now, but it certainly was a performance that was registering for people. And I just think the kind of charming, light nature of the performance may have appealed to people who were turned off by some of the darkness going on with Elizabeth Taylor. So that would be my guess, but you very well could be right about Anouk Aimée. I think that's a very strong possibility as well. But final question for you. Who would you have voted for from this lineup?
Oh, Liz. Like, I don't even have to think about it. Liz Taylor. Like, it's
Yeah.
as easy as that.
Yeah, for all previous reasons stated, I would 100% be on the Elizabeth Taylor winning train here. And as much as I like a lot of these other performances, it's really not close, to be honest. I just feel like this is a masterpiece of a performance and masterclass, I should say. I'm glad that she got the opportunity to showcase what she was capable of here. So, with that, thank you so much, Kayleigh, for doing this marathon episode. This was a blast talking with you about all of these films and such a unique year of Best Actress. So, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm always up to talk about Oscar bullshit, and I'm always up to talk about Liz Taylor. So this was just, frankly, the ideal way for an aged, smothered 32-year-old to spend her night.
Wow.
That's the only problem I had with this whole thing is I'm going to be lying if it's fucking 32.
I know. Trust me. Yeah, I'm with you. But yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this and putting in the work. And where can people find more of you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter at Kayleigh, Ceilidhann. The lion's share of my work is on pajaba.com, but you can find me scattered around the internet on places like Paste and Flashfilm and Uproxx and IGN and redreaper.com. Google me and just don't click on Reddit links. And I have a newsletter called Gossip Reading Club on letterdrop.com, which I take a piece of vintage celebrity reporting and offer like analysis and wider context on it. So we're really interested in things like the very first profile of Liz Taylor's first wedding that was in the fan magazines in the 50s. I have a piece on that. If you're really interested in the Brendan Fraser comeback or time someone wrote about the diaries of Heath Ledger after he'd already died, I have all that too. So that's on letterdrop.com.
Wow, I did not even know that, and I will be looking into that now. So thank you. Well, thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The show's at Oscar Runner Up, Instagram at And the Runner Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you like what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/And the Runner Up Is. And next week, we are delving into the lineup, which is 1967 Best Actress. The nominees were Anne Bancroft in The Graduate, Faye Dunaway in Bonnie and Clyde, Edith Evans in The Whisperers, Audrey Hepburn in Wait Until Dark, and Katharine Hepburn in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. A real murderer's row there, with the winner being Katharine Hepburn. So that is what to watch before next week. Thanks again, Kayleigh.
No worries.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu.